Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video, I'm back talking about another season of Survivor, where here I'll be giving my very detailed thoughts on the latest season, Survivor 45. A season that, despite it being in the new era and through that has a lot of fundamental issues and aspects of its format that I personally don't like, I do come out of this season being surprisingly high on it, at least higher on it than the other new era seasons, to where again I found this season to be a mostly fun ride. And I do feel like a lot of that came from the choice to have 90-minute episodes, not just the added time that was put onto the show that allowed for there to be more time spent on camp life and showcasing the tribe dynamics, but also I did feel like it led to a lot of interesting production decisions, to where, despite again I don't love the dangerous fun mantra that Survivor production seems to be obsessed with, I do actually feel like this season, again, despite some qualms here and there, mostly had a format that allowed the players to play and not be confined as much as some other points in the new era, particularly the first half of 44, which was a massive low point for player agency. And again, mixing that in with a pretty entertaining cast, I do feel like this season is the new peak of the new era. And while that peak might still not be the best Survivor we've ever seen, I do come out of this season again feeling mostly positive about it, and also the trajectory of the series, which can't be said for the last few seasons of the show. But with that, again, I got a lot to say about the season, as you would expect, so we're obviously going to be running through my thoughts on the season from beginning to end. And with that, let's start off with the premiere, where we obviously started off with the players riding in on boats, with Drew getting the first confessional here, talking about being one of the smartest to ever be on Survivor, and saying that Survivor is going to be more difficult than the Ivy League, giving us immediate personal content from him, with it making it pretty clear that he's going to be one of this season's main narrators. We also get to see Katurah, who gets a strong opening confessional here, probably an even stronger one, talking about how she's going to lie about being a lawyer, as it would make her come off as strategic, which would get her voted out, saying this while she's also laughing about slashing throats. And really, to me, this ends up being a pretty perfect opening confessional, one that gives her personal content, while also describing her plan on how she plans on playing the game, while also showing her as a fun, rootable personality, which leads to her having a near perfect premiere episode, which ends up being strange considering how one-dimensional her edit gets after this. Another interesting edit on this season comes from Emily, who instantly talks about not caring about the experience and says that it's a waste of time if she's not the sole survivor. Interesting line that can be interpreted as a winner quote, but really I do feel like it is mostly utilized to be ironic, where Emily ends up going on this massive character journey to where she obviously gets a pretty negative portrayal in this premiere, only for her to learn from her mistakes and seemingly grow as a person, doing the complete opposite of what she says here. We also get an introduction to Jake, who gets a solid opening confessional that we had already seen in the season preview of Jake talking about living with his grandma, and that if he wins, he's moving out of grandma's house. And a decent opening confessional here from him. Definitely shows his big personality, though obviously pretty much lacking game-wise. The last player to get introduced in this initial scene ends up being Sifu, who instantly comes off as a pretty wacky character, again feeling coach-like, and him giving himself a nickname, him doing Tai Chi moves on the boat and air guitar in his confessionals, so he really comes off as a larger-than-life character, which is why it's so underwhelming that he becomes one of the most under-edited figures of this season, where while he is very present in the premiere, his edit pretty much completely dies off afterwards, for along with that, he also never seems to get any real traction in the game either. Now following that, we get a few shorter confessionals before Jeff's typical spiel, with Sean talking about reclaiming lost time, which really plays into his storyline, though I'm kind of surprised they even bothered to show him here, considering the context of how he leaves. We also hear Kelly revealing that she's a nurse and that she has a dagger behind her back, a fine confessional that feels like a watered down version of Katurah's, but it was good enough to have Kelly as a pretty top contender early on for me. Finally, we do see Dee, who doesn't get any personal content here, though does claim that she was made for this and will play like it's her only chance. Again, another fine confessional, especially considering how short of one it was. was, with it really playing into the way that production looks at the game at this point. Though outside that, not really having much substance to it. But anyway, the tribes obviously arrive on a big boat where we do get more confessionals. We get to see Austin get a pretty generic one, talking about how excited he is to be there, with him just wanting to run around and find idols, which ends up being the bulk of his content in the premiere. And really just in general, his edit ends up being so revolved around advantages to where that was such an early sign to him clearly being set up to be a big player of the season, but one that wasn't necessarily going to win. We also see Sabaya get personal content right away, comparing this to boot camp and being in the Marines, to where she ends up having a pretty solid edit for an early boot here. And finally, we do get Kendra strangely getting some Dodo music playing while talking about how great her tribe is, with this really giving mixed signals about how we're supposed to feel about her, where she does end up getting some pretty strong personal content and content about her relationships, all while the rest of her edit really felt reminiscent to someone like a Debbie Hanner. But she does end this confessional by saying that she's happy that Bruce is on her tribe, where obviously Bruce from Survivor 44 obviously ends up on this cast, being the first returning player of the new era, having gotten the invite for the season immediately after his medevac episode aired, to where despite him coming into the season as a returning player, he really ends up being an unknown quantity, and boy was I shocked at what we got from that. But again, it does feel like Bruce was poised to do extremely well on this season, with most people in the preseason coming into it seemingly wanting to work with him, which is funny considering how this actually turns out. But anyway, we then get to the Matt chat with there being a lot of energy from this cast, to where Jeff does say that this is the most energy he's seen in 23 years. And we do get a pretty funny little moment of Seafood dancing and Jeff just stopping to watch him. But also here, this season finally ends up breaking the Matt chat theory, where every winner of the new era up to this point has gotten a question during the initial Matt chat. So this season really didn't have many questions being asked at all. Thankfully, this isn't actually becoming a trend, because that would be stupid. But Brandon ends up being the first to get a question here, immediately coming off as a super fan who is just excited to be there despite being a bit out of his element, with us seeing him cry as he gets on the boat and him talking about how he's dreamed about this since he was 11. And Brandon is someone that even I had heard of coming into this season. I know he's someone that was super active in the online reality TV community, to where really happy to see him get a shot here, even though it doesn't turn out that well for him. But the only other player to get a question during the Matt chat ends up being Bruce, where he gets asked if his previous experience is an advantage, to which he says it isn't, to where Emily ends up making a face to that response and pushes back for some reason, saying that he is more mentally prepared than them, and says that he's already talking with authority and with instruction, which is all contradictory, which is just funny to see her pretty much point out his exact gameplay style right from the beginning. And again, while she's not wrong in what she's saying, it's like also, Emily, why are you saying this? Again, it is fun TV, obviously, but it is terrible gameplay, making a target of herself by being the outspoken one from the beginning and also creating a vendetta against Bruce for down the road. But anyway, we get to the first challenge, which functions similarly to previous New Era seasons, where the winner gets Flint, while the losers have to earn the Flint another way. And here we do get some fun from Seafood just jumping around like an anime character, and Lulu ends up getting a big lead here through the rowing, only for Brandon to struggle getting up the ladder, to which we do end up seeing him have a panic attack, which obviously makes you feel for him there, though I will also say it was pretty funny to see him struggling climbing a ladder, and also funny to see Sean just leave him behind initially, only for him to have to go back and save him. And then we see like Brandon collapsing and just rolling to the finish line, which again was a little humorous. Though it all comes down to the final part, which Drew ends up having a massive advantage there due to his height, leading to Reba winning the challenge. So afterwards, we do see Brandon having medical being brought in to look at him, which had he been medevaced in this instance, this would have been such a tragic run on this season. But this is also where we do get a confessional from Hannah, being overwhelmed, wondering what she's gotten herself into, which I wonder if that'll be relevant. But this is also where we get the reveal that there is a shakeup to how Sweat and Savvy are going to work, where it gets transformed into a journey, where Lulu and Bello have to pick two people from each of their tribes to send to the challenge, where we do see Caleb and Sabaya being picked for Lulu and Jake and Brando for Bello. So we're at the Sweat and Savvy task, we see that's been changed to become a head-to-head, mixing both Sweat and Savvy, where you have to move around 40 logs, then do this puzzle to remove the flint from this metal structure, where the first to finish ends up winning the flint. So if neither of them finish, both tribes get nothing. And what do you know? They both fail, which is pretty insane to see both tribes not getting flint in this first challenge here, and in turn Lulu ends up never getting flint across its OG run, though I personally didn't mind this change. I mean, while I would still prefer to just do neither version of Sweat or Savvy, I did feel like this one at least felt like it had more stakes, though it also was just an excuse to have another challenge on the show. And considering a certain twist that was completely cut from the show due to the lack of time, I do feel like something like this just comes off as completely unnecessary to me. But the challenge does serve as an introduction to both Brando and Caleb, with Brando getting very surface level confessionals here, and this ends up being really his only content in the premiere, making him a very unlikely winner from the get-go, while Caleb, who ends up being one of the biggest characters of the first half of the season, gets introduced here by him talking about how great Sabaya is. So he's not winning either. But now let's get into talking about the individual tribes, starting off with Reba, who were the most under-edited tribe of the premiere here, which is funny considering the complexity given to the tribe following this episode, to where I would say that they are the tribe that we got to know the most by the time of the merge, or at least the core members of it, though they didn't end up getting that much to do here initially, to where we don't get to see any of the true dynamics throughout the premiere, though J Maya is the first person to get a confessional as they're walking into their camp, with her talking about how stacked they are and how winning a challenge is on her Survivor bucket list, I guess. Though outside of mentioning that she's a singer, with her being the first to introduce herself, her content here ends up being again pretty generic, to where that, along with the fact that she also gets one of the more subdued edits moving forward, she really ends up being one of the least likely winners right off the bat. Now, Julie also gets introduced here as a single mom that teaches an art class, only for her to reveal in the confessional that she's actually a lawyer, playing into a theme with this season, the theme of authenticity, that really runs rampant throughout the early portions of the season, with the show really highlighting the different approaches players have surrounding this theme, with players like Julie and Katurah lying about who they really are, while you have players who try to remain more authentic, like Emily. But this leads to content from Drew, with him proceeding to get pretty strong content that perfectly fits into both sides of this conflict, talking about how he has two identities within him, and talking about how he has Drew, who is this introspective person that writes poetry, while also having Basile, who comes out at the bar and wants to be friends with everybody. And between those two personalities, there's a well-rounded and confident person, which really shows you the multiple sides of his authenticity, which was really a great confessional for him that made him a top contender for me early on the season, with it feeling like he perfectly fit into these themes. But from a game front, we do kick it all off with Sifu looking for an idol right away and thinking that the others aren't noticing him, only for us to obviously cut back to camp with people talking about how he's obviously looking for an idol, with there being a lot of talk about how he's playing a Tony-like game, with this actually feeling pretty reminiscent to Tony's Game Changers run. Though this is where we do get to see a decent amount of content from Dee, with her really clocking Sifu's game. That felt like them going out of their way to really prop up Dee as a player here, and how perceptive she is, which was definitely a good sign for her edit there. But this all happens while Austin ends up being the one to actually find the Beware advantage, with him getting a task of having to decode a message on the tribe flag, meaning that he has to do it obviously in public, which is a fun little task here. And with that, I guess we should talk about the changes that were made to the Beware advantages with the 90-minute episodes here, which obviously allowed them to experiment a bit more, with them obviously creating these longer tasks that need to be done to eventually get your idol, which obviously does heighten the amount of focus on advantages on the show, though really I did think it turned out mostly fine here, especially with the 90-minute format. But I really didn't love the inconsistency in the tasks that they had to do to get the idols here, where obviously the tasks are different for each tribe, which is good in the sense that obviously it lessens the repetitiveness of them, which was an issue I had with Survivor 43, but obviously it leads to to some idols being easier to get than others, especially considering a certain other mechanic in the game that made this feel like a really unnecessary level of variance to add here, though again, we'll talk about that later. Now with that, we then cut to the Belo tribe, where a lot of the focus here goes onto Bruce initially, with him having the obvious talk about how this is his second chance, but we then transition to him talking about his strategy of not being the dad, but instead wanting to be Uncle Bruce, with him wanting to come off as a chill and relatable guy, only for us to cut to him barking orders and giving advice that Kendra instantly calls out that he's someone that just can't help it, showing his attempt at not being authentic instantly fail for him, which constantly causes him issues moving forward in the game. But this is all while the women end up talking, bonding over the fact that they are similar ages and they're all Virgos, being the only true alliance being set up in the premiere here that did leave them as my top contenders coming out of this premiere, with this being pretty good content for all of them here, with Kendra and Kelly talking about vibing with each other early on, and us getting good strategic content from Kelly, with her clearly being set up as the biggest player from this tribe, while Kendra also talks about wanting to break the trend of women going home early, which was a big talking point coming in this season, with them having obviously just seen the pre-merge of Survivor 44, where it does end up paying some dividends in the pre-merge here, where the majority of the boots here end up being men. But obviously this alliance also ends up including Katurah, who is finally lying about her life through this instance, where again they bond over being similar ages, with Katurah saying she's 29 when in reality she's actually 35, obviously doing so to make herself more relatable. That really ends up playing into her storyline here, with her coming off initially as this epitome of the inauthentic track of this theme, with this leading to the women talking about how Jake has to be the first to go, with Kendra being worried about him as he's a lawyer, seeming like justification for Katurah's decision to lie about her job, which again, all this being really strong content for Katurah early on, where she was my number one contender coming out of this premiere, which is bolstered even more by this pretty funny combo we see following this between her and Jake, with her really selling the lie by asking him questions about what it's like to be a lawyer. Though again, another thing here is that despite Jake seeming to be this representation of authenticity in this instance, he himself is actually lying as well, with him lying about the type of lawyer that he is, though obviously that didn't make the edit to make him fit into that role better. But through that, again, this ends up being a pretty bad start for Jake, with Katurah literally even saying that he should know better, which really ends up demeriting his gameplay through this premiere. But anyway, then we cut to Lulu, where only Emily, Sean, and Hannah are at camp initially, to where we end up seeing Emily right away talking about targeting Caleb and Sabiyah, thinking that they're sus for volunteering to go in the journey, where Emily's targeting of them did cause some people to claim that she was being racist online for doing so, and straight up, obviously it isn't a good look for her to instantly be targeting the two black people on her tribe and talking about them as this instant alliance, though I do think within the context of what's going on here, it does make sense to think that they're going to end up working together when, again, they just went on a journey together, are spending their initial moments in the game together, and both are obviously perceived as the strongest players on the tribe together, along with the fact that it's also just kind of easy to target them as, again, they're away from the tribe. So, again, while optic-wise, yes, this is certainly not a good look, I truly don't think race played much of a factor into Emily targeting them here. But following this, we do have Brandon now arriving on a boat after being checked up by the doctors, with us now seeing just how lost his tribe seems to be, with no one knowing how to make a shelter. And we do get this funny visual of Hannah just sweeping the ground for some reason, trying to look busy. But we do end up seeing Brandon and Hannah bonding over how unsurvivory they are, leading to fun banter between the two, and them ending up crying together. And I did find this to be a pretty endearing relationship here, though I do think it makes you really question the tribe divisions, where it feels like they put all these ill-equipped players on the Lulu tribe, which just felt like a recipe for disaster here, to where you could even tell preseason how underpowered this tribe seemed to be in comparison to the other two. So unsurprisingly, I feel like they come out of this as one of the worst starting tribes of all time. But eventually Caleb and Sabiyah end up returning, and we do end up seeing Sean instantly ratting out Emily to Sabiyah, with them supposedly being a really strong duo duo during the early days of this season, despite more focus going into the Caleb Sabaya relationship on the show. But Sean still ends up being on the show here, getting content similar to Brando, and it, again, being pretty surface level, and him coming off easily as the least complex figure of the Lulu tribe. But considering his result, again, I'm surprised they didn't just completely purple him, as I feel like they probably would have had this been seasons ago, to where he actually gets a decent amount of narrational content through his short run on the season. But Sabaya ends up taking the leadership role on the tribe and ends up being a main narrator for the early days of Lulu, and we do see her instantly organize the votes against Emily, leading to us getting some foundational content around Emily being a pessimist and her not gelling well with the tribe, with us getting this funny content about her mocking her tribe, calling them crazy people while they discuss if aliens made the pyramids, which really just shows you her lack of social skills here, which obviously ends up being improved in future episodes. But with that, we finally get to the immunity challenge, obviously a typical obstacle course with a puzzle at the end, as most first immunity challenges are nowadays. So we do end up seeing Lulu struggling to even get to the puzzle, to where Caleb seems to be one of the only good competitors on this tribe. Though we do see them do a pretty innovative move here in utilizing their buffs to pull each other up. But really throughout all this, Chef did seem to be clearly annoyed at the Lulu tribe for performing so terribly, which was kind of funny to see. But through that, obviously Lulu ends up losing the challenge. There's something strange about this round of gameplay that we didn't even get to see, is that there was an entire twist that just didn't make the show, that we actually had to hear about through Exit Press and through the On Fire podcast, and that Bello, being the winning tribe here, actually got to send a player to Lulu in the lead up to Tribal, to which they end up picking Kendra to go. Though again, Kendra's entire visit to the Lulu tribe ends up being completely cut from the show, and I could fully understand why. I mean, they clearly didn't have enough time to show it, to which I really just don't even get how they even thought they would fit this into the episode. Now, I don't know if they thought they were getting a 2-hour premiere instead of a 90-minute one, because again, it just feels ridiculous to think they even thought this would fit. And through Kendra's role on the Lulu tribe being completely cut out of the show, it did feel pretty bad for Kendra's edit as a whole. Now, I didn't completely knock it entirely against her, as it just felt like something that had to be cut, but definitely not a good sign for your winning chances if your involvement in this big twist on the season just gets completely nullified from the show. But as for the twist itself, I mean, I really actually don't mind this on paper. Again, it does allow for players to build more relationships and connections coming into the merge, and really the initial part of this twist is not that dissimilar from just a typical kidnapping that we had seen in seasons past. Though something I don't love about this is also adding in the aspect of this person actually having a vote that no one knows about, and again, I think that part of it's pretty lame. I don't love the aspect of you being able to be voted out by someone that isn't even on your tribe, that you're not even aware that person even having a vote, to where it would have sucked if someone actually went out that way through vote from someone that they didn't even have on their tribe until a few hours ago. But again, just as a whole, this is a twist that I don't actually mind that much, and I was actually kind of surprised that it didn't appear on more episodes, as we had heard about this twist coming into the season, where I very much expected it to be on every single episode, but for it to only be in the premiere and just not even make the cut was very bizarre. But as for what we do get on the show, I mean, honestly, we do get a lot from Hannah here, where she talks about being happy that they lost the challenge, as now she can go home. Where really the rest of this episode is set up as this pretty clear Emily vote, outside the possible chance of Hannah deciding to quit the game, where obviously Hannah does end up quitting, which ends up being a pretty big talking point after this episode, people being so upset her even being cast on the show, and then people proceeded to review bomb her business, and I get people being upset over someone quitting, especially these people that actually want to be on the show, and see someone that actually got to be on it not take full advantage of that opportunity. But straight up, I personally don't care that much. And for people that think that, oh, she stole my spot on the show, I mean, like, maybe you should have just done better in casting. And for fans that try to ruin her life outside the show because she didn't want to participate in a game show anymore, just feels really pathetic in my mind. And straight up, her quitting didn't really affect my enjoyment of this episode at all. I mean, to me, it kept Emily in the game, who is obviously going to end up making great TV down the road. It gets rid of someone who, again, doesn't want to be there without really harming the pacing of the show. And also, it's like, at least she owns her quit. it's not like a certain future quit that we'll talk about, where Hannah fully admits that she realized that she's not meant to play Survivor and that she can't hack it out there, to where, and I personally wasn't that insulted by this quit. Now, I also know that part of her explanation of why she quit was also her struggling with nicotine withdrawal, which obviously we've seen in the past with other players that had a massive impact on their runs on the season, to where, again, that seems like a somewhat reasonable explanation for her leaving as well, to where, again, you can definitely criticize aspects of Hannah's run on this season. Again, be upset at her for quitting, but I think when you take it to a level beyond just simply what it is of her being a participant on a game show, I think that's where it personally gets a bit ridiculous to me. But beyond that, we see Brandon having kind of similar thoughts to Hannah, just without the aspect of wanting to quit the game. But he does feel bad about staying over people that perform better than him, and we do see him deciding to tell Caleb and Sabiyah that he's going to use his shot in the dark tonight, which they're obviously confused by. And again, I do empathize with Brandon here, having these panic attacks while out there and really struggling with the emotional aspects of the game. But just straight up, I mean, this is bad play, and it does seem to put a target on his back with him being set up as the backup vote, though to be fair, probably would have been anyway. But this is where we then cut to Emily, who is attempting to still put together a plan with Hannah and Brandon to try to split up Caleb and Sabiyah, where it did seem like there was this opportunity to execute a 3-2-1 plan, but never felt like it was actually going to go through, especially with Hannah wanting to quit. And even then, the concept of getting rid of the most physical guy on your tribe, when they were assuming that there was going to be any tribe slots in the season, where due to the fact that there hadn't been a proper one in the entire new era, it really just felt like a death knell for that plan. But with that, we then finally get to tribal, which ends up being a really notable one here, where we do again get Emily thinking that she's on her way out, calling out Sabiyah for preaching to keep around the strong, which obviously benefits her game. And we do have Sabiyah fighting back, saying that she never begged to be in the strength role, which, I mean, I'm pretty sure in the preseason she was talking about how she wanted to be the leader of her tribe, but whatever. I mean, this ends up being a somewhat combative tribal here, with none of that ending up really mattering here, as Hannah ends up piping up, saying that she wants to watch this all unfold from the comfort of her home. And we clearly end up seeing Jeff being annoyed at her, giving her this death stare, as it becomes more and more clear that she wants to quit the game, to where Hannah ends up essentially threatening the other players to vote her out, or else she'll quit anyway, leading to everyone agreeing to vote her out, with Jeff ending up orchestrating a Varner/Austin-esque vote off here, with him just doing so verbally and not getting to properly vote, which I know annoyed some people, as obviously doesn't allow the players to have as much control in this instance. And in an idealistic world, yeah, I get it. I would want them to properly vote too, but from a production standpoint, I do fully understand why they didn't do it. Though, to be fair, they're not even super consistent in following this trend anyway. But again, I do think from a production standpoint, you obviously don't want to risk the players voting someone out and then also Hannah quitting immediately after that, where they'll obviously mess with the schedule. So from the guarantee that their schedule stays intact, I do get why they made this vote a verbal one, and again, it didn't really bother me too much. Though Jeff does end up snuffing her torch, which has been announced that he will stop doing this moving forward for quitters, which, well, again, quits in general don't really bother me too much on Survivor, especially if they're in these rare cases. I do think this is the right call from a production standpoint, as obviously they don't want people to quit, and this obviously just further incentivizes them to do so. But with that, we obviously lose Hannah, who is someone that I did enjoy on the show. Although she had a fun personality in Confessionals, I liked her relationship with Brandon, but again, she just seemed like someone that wasn't really cut out for Survivor. Someone that I think production was probably hoping that she would be in like the Suri Field sort of mold of her, again, not really seeming to know what she's doing coming into it from a survival aspect, but kind of pick up on it along the way and become this rootable figure down the road. Though again, it never really got to that, to where straight away, even early in the preseason, I was expecting her to be an early boot, though the fact that she ends up quitting instead was a surprise. And straight up, I think she was actually probably a somewhat better player than I was expecting, in the sense that she technically wasn't going to get voted out. That's something. But really, at the end of the day, obviously just someone that probably shouldn't have been on Survivor to begin with. But with that, we then get to episode 2, where due to the 90-minute episodes, we do get the return of the previously on along with the opening credits, which I know a lot of people were super excited for, but I didn't personally care. I mean, to me, this just gives me an extra minute to where I don't have to pay attention to the show. And while it is cool that it exists, I never personally cared about having to watch it on the TV screen every episode. And something to note here is that they also decided to add in a bit of an Easter egg for every episode, where there's a clip that ends up foreshadowing something that happens later in the episode, which is a cool little touch, though it does get a bit spoilery, as we'll talk about a bit later. Anyway, the episode obviously starts with us seeing reactions to the Hannah quit, with Sean saying that he's surprised, but he can see why she would do that, which obviously feels like foreshadowing in itself. But we also end up seeing Emily ending up apologizing to Caleb and Sabiyah, leading to radically different reactions here. From Sabiyah, we see her fighting back with Emily, to where we do see Emily talking about feeling like she's being gaslit and says Sabiyah took it personally, which just really further expands their feud, while we see Caleb take a different approach, where he talks about wanting to help her and nurse her back to health and make her a better player, obviously instead picking her up as a number and becoming this mentor to her, being a strong play from Caleb, one that literally ends up saving him the following round, and one that feels like Survivor 101 of keeping all your options open, that we just don't see people take full advantage of at all points. But again, it feels like Caleb was one of those people that utilizes that notion to great effect. But this also ends up being pretty great for Emily as well, where we do see her take his advice, which seemed to improve her social game here, to where it does start this evolution in her character, but also seemed to change her as a person in her real life, where we hear her saying that she used to try to brute force things, but now needs to be more calm, and gets emotional and saying that she just doesn't know when to stop, seeming to actually take these lessons to heart, which again feels directly opposed to her opening statements about how she doesn't care about the experience and just wants to win. But again, by episode 2, we already have her realizing that she was wrong and ends up developing from that state of mind, which again, truth be told, is my state of mind, but obviously not what production wants out of their players, where they love this aspect of a player finding themselves and growing throughout the experience, which is something that again I personally don't care about, though this obviously still ends up remaining pretty strong content for Emily from an Edgic perspective. But beyond that, we do get a lot of focus on the idol hunt as well, with Emily obviously feeling pretty screwed here and needing to save herself in the game, to where she unashamedly ends up searching in the open, which leads to the rest of the tribe going searching as well, to where Brandon talks about really wanting to find the idol for himself, to which he ends up finding the Beware Vantage right in front of Sabiyah. In a move that he had talked about in the preseason press, he decides to just give it to her so that she is the one that has to risk her vote in this instance, and it allows for him to also build trust with Sabiyah, which I don't think is necessarily a bad play, though I think for you to actually do this, you probably should be ideally in a better position in the tribe, where I think the issue here is that Brand's obviously someone that is clearly on the bottom alongside Emily, and while this might end up increasing his chances of staying over Emily, I do think it was probably worth it for him to risk his vote in order to potentially get an idol in this instance, though again, had it been someone like a Caleb or especially someone like a Sean, I do think it definitely would have been more so in their best interest to make this sort of play. But with that, we then transition over to Reba, where Sifu gets a bit of a character piece here about him essentially just being an anime character, alongside J. Maya getting content about her trying to decode the code on the flag, which really doesn't give her much depth either, and is mainly used as a transition to talk about Austin's idol hunt, with him decoding the sign, though still not finding the idol in this episode. Now beyond that, we also get a notable D character segment here about her big toe and her declaring that she has big toe energy as she picks up a branch with it, which was all really weird. Now obviously this was all foreshadowing to her later immunity win, but at this time it really just came off as a bit strange, to where it did kind of boost my opinion on D's edit, as again, why else is this here? But finally we do get to see the game dynamics on Reba here, with Julie surprisingly being the one to outline them, with her revealing that D is her closest ally, and also the fact that she has a good relation with Drew, with her saying that he reminds her of her son, to which we end up seeing them agree to bring in and Austin to create a majority that ends up being the strongest reoccurring alliance on this season, in a season that strangely didn't have many established alliances sticking together, which made it pretty clear that this group was set up to make a pretty deep run on the season. But along with that also comes, again, some strong content for Drew, once again, with him saying that all this was his plan anyway, and how he now has a lot of allies at this point, and despite him wanting to be the king, he has to play it down, and that he's going to bring his kingdom to fruition. Again, really just him getting to narrate over the alliance's creation, which really solidified that he was going to end up being one of the season's bigger players. But then we then cut to Belo, where they end up getting a lot of content surrounding Bruce, with it sending largely mixed signals here, starting off with some pretty positive content from him, being the one to make the fire, and we do see Jake talking about vibing with him, setting up their relationship, and we do also see Bruce just generally joking around and people seeming to get along with him, only for us to cut to Katurah, with this starting off this really fun rivalry between the two, which leads to a lot of fun back and forth between Bruce doing something wacky and then us getting a confessional from Katurah with her voicing her frustrations with him, where here we do end up seeing her complaining about how much he talks and him constantly talking about his previous season, to where we have Bruce name dropping Kane, which of all the people from Survivor 44, I think Kane might be the least name drop worthy person. But anyway, this rivalry between Bruce and Katurah ends up being fun content, though for Katurah in particular, I did feel like it was a bit underwhelming in the fact that it was just so one-dimensional. It ends up being a major focus of her edit moving forward, which, considering how complex of a figure she came off in the premiere, it really just ends up sinking her winning chances, though again, not to the point where I was completely out on her just yet, as again, a lot of the recent winners of the show did have set up rivalries during the pre-merge. You have Jandrim and Josh, you have Gabler and Ellie, these rivalries that end up culminating at the merge. So for me, I did feel like she still had legs in her edit until a bit later on in the season. But here we also get content around the grander tribe dynamics, though largely through the point of view of Brando, who does get a dose of personal content here, and is shown to be bonding with the Women's Alliance by wearing his buff as a top alongside them, but also shown to be working with the guys as well, with this content from Brando, particularly him talking about how nervous he was coming into the game and how he's now killing it, really did scream out to me as content being set up, him now being in good position, only for it to completely crumble later in the game, to where by the time of the swap, I really pegged him to be one of the most likely people to be booted before the merge. But with that, we do also see him working alongside Kelly, who also ends up playing the middle as well, seemingly effectively through the early game, where despite her seemingly being against Bruce, and talks after the fact about how Bruce would have been the first boot from their tribe had they gone to tribal, Bruce seemed to actually look at Kelly as his number one, even over the likes of Jake, who we were shown him to be closer to early on in this season, which is pretty insane. But despite that, the edit does focus a lot more on Jake being in danger here, with him being portrayed as having an accurate read on the game, with him calling out that the women are coming together, which made it pretty clear that Jake's edit had a bit more legs to it than Bruce's, whose edit does largely come off as one-dimensional and also pretty negative as a whole. But eventually we end up seeing boats coming in to each of the tribes, revealing that we obviously have a journey this episode, where Emily ends up obviously wanting to go for her tribe, though they end up stopping her, and instead pick Brandon, which I don't get why, as he was the secondary target. Why wouldn't you send someone like Sean or Caleb or Sabaya, but whatever. As for the other two tribes, they ended up deciding by chance, with Drew and Bruce getting picked to go, leading to more fun content from Bruce of him just being a goofball as the boat leaves the camp, and us to get Katurah ranting about him in the confessional, saying, "Who is this guy?" Eventually, we obviously see the players gather and talk about their respective camps, with Brandon being pretty open about the Lulu dynamics, while we do end up seeing Bruce being really cagey about Belo, with Drew calling this out as bad gameplay, which is funny considering from the post-game interviews, it does seem like Drew himself was also very tight with information. But again, this just ends up being another dig at Bruce's edit. But eventually the players go off on their own, are given the opportunity to risk their votes and participate in a challenge we've seen before of sorting these tiles to find the lock combination, to which obviously they have a certain amount of time to do so. And this was fine. I mean, nice to see the show. Again, put the decision back into the players' hands, where in 44 they obviously forced them to risk their vote. So we're here again, we see Bruce decide to not go for it. Finally, in a spot where he probably should have. Well, we end up seeing Brandon and Drew going for it with obviously varying results, where we do see Brandon, despite thinking that he would do well at this, continuing his losing streak here and getting it wrong, which, again, funny how he didn't give up his vote to get the Beware advantage, only for him to then lose his vote here anyway. And him later revealing to his tribe that he lost at another puzzle did seem to further sink his chances of staying, with Sean talking about how he's the puzzle guy and he's not even that good at puzzles, which makes them question what good is he, feeling like a clear setup to his boots. Meanwhile, Drew ends up solving the combo in time and in turn wins safety without power. A decent advantage to dole out here, not being extremely powerful, but still providing its user with immunity to where, again, it does feel like a largely balanced advantage to add to the game at this point. It also obviously has an added benefit to it from a production standpoint in the fact that it takes away another vote from Tribal, which is just something that they obviously love. But we don't end up seeing Drew end up using the advantage itself, though we do end up seeing him use it in a pretty interesting way, with him telling everyone about his safety without power, really trying to portray himself as this loyal player, which is probably the right approach for him, considering the fact that his archetype is one that is constantly coming into the game being looked at as schemy, which Drew ends up being an expert as deflecting that reputation. There's also here where we do establish the Austin and Drew relationship, with Austin recruiting him to help him find the idol, which this relationship obviously ends up being a pretty important one moving forward. But this really ends up just solidifying how great of an episode this ends up being for Drew, to where I end up having him as my top contender coming out of this episode, which while that doesn't end up sticking, again, he does end up having one of the more consistent edits throughout the season. But with that, we finally get to the immunity challenge, which ends up being a typical water challenge of jumping for the key and then doing a balance beam before doing a puzzle at the end. Though it is here where we get the reveal of the new sit out rule of you not being able to sit out same player in back-to-back challenges regardless of what cycle those challenges are in, which I'm surprised it took them this long to make that change, as you could just tell how annoyed Jeff was at seeing Abby Maria constantly sit out at the time of Philippines. So I'm surprised they didn't change it then, but obviously it seems like Claire from 44 was the last straw here, and again, this is just a rule that should have been there to begin with, so I personally don't mind it being implemented to the game. But for the challenge itself, we do end up seeing some pretty hard falls on the balance beam, in particular from Kendra taking a pretty big hit, and we do also get a lot of bragging about how this is a brand new puzzle, which, I guess, it just looked like a normal puzzle. I don't know why they were so proud of this. Like, it didn't do anything unique. So again, I found it funny how much they bragged about it. But anyway, Brando and Kelly do really well at the puzzle, while Sabaya and Brandon end up bickering over it, to where Lulu ends up winning the challenge once again, where at this point it was pretty clear that Brandon was going home, considering the massive uptick in positive content for Emily and this constant dunking on Brandon. But they do try to build up this dilemma between the two. Though I felt like there was no real suspense here, where we do end up seeing both Sean and Caleb fighting to keep Emily, while Sabaya ends up wanting to keep Brandon in a position where they do really try to make it seem like Sabaya is the decision maker here, which did feel largely fabricated considering the fact that she's obviously clearly outnumbered and doesn't even have a vote in this instance. By the way, here we also get more of the idol hunt, with Sabaya now recruiting Sean and Caleb to help her find it, to where they end up finally getting it from a tree, only for it to turn out that the idol is inside of a block of wax, to which needed to be burned out of there, which would have led to this fun heist sequence of having to burn it in the public and trying to get people out of camp long enough for you to be able to do so. But the problem with all that is the fact that Lulu doesn't have fire, which again makes this unfair in comparison to what happened to Reba idol, where again they didn't need fire to get their idol. Yet here essentially fire ends up being a prerequisite for getting an idol on this tribe, which again, the concept of having fire is just never a guarantee in the new era. So yeah, I just didn't like adding that level of variance here, though again, Jeff claims that this was a complete oversight on their end. But either way, through the rest of the episode, we do end up seeing some pretty good play from Emily, with her giving Sabiyah her shot in the dark to earn trust, which again, this is where we do learn that the shot in the dark is transferable. And through that, it was pretty cool to see Emily using this as a bit of leverage here. Again, taking what would have been a 1 in 6 chance of saving herself if she did rely on the shot in the dark, instead be able to use it to just try to save yourself socially, which again seems like a pretty basic move to be made here, but again, we haven't seen it in the 4 seasons before this that had shot in the dark. So kudos to Emily for actually being the first one to utilize a strategy like this. But again, this really just shows her putting more effort into her social game, which in turn ends up showing off her evolution of her realizing the importance of relationships in the game. But with that, we finally get the tribal where Brandon was clearly going home, and we do get this weird moment of Jeff telling his story about how he was a water boy in middle school and how Brandon is the water boy of the tribe, which was all very strange. But Brandon ends up being voted out here unanimously. And again, I really liked Brandon on the show. I mean, while again, he's another one of these that is probably not meant for Survivor, clearly seemed completely out of his depth, I still was happy to see him actually get a true shot here. And while again, he didn't come off as the greatest player by the end of it, definitely a light version of someone like a Jacob Derwin. Though, I mean, to give him credit, it did seem like Brandon was like socially. It does seem like his social skills were definitely the best aspects of his game. And in contrast to Jacob Derwin, who seemed to just be bad socially. Obviously, just the issue is the fact that he's like a liability physically. He also lacks confidence in himself, to where it really just felt like the tribe had no real faith in his overall competition ability. And again, on a tribe like Lulu that's constantly losing, you do need to keep around competent challenge competitors, which Brand just seemed to not be. But again, I still found it endearing to see him live out his childhood dream of being on Survivor, and I still found Brand to be a pretty fun casting choice on this season. Now for episode 3, which ends up being a pretty strong episode here, debatably the best of the season, with this also probably being up there amongst the best pre-merge episodes in the history of the show, with the tribal in particularly being really strong here. And it all obviously starts off on Lulu, where you see obviously the reaction to the previous vote, where Sabiyah ends up giving Emily the shot in the dark back, which was an interesting move here from Sabiyah's point of view, with even Emily being surprised that she did so here. And on paper, it really does not seem like a super optimal move here, considering the likelihood that they would just go to another tribal, and now you're risking that Emily will have the shot in the dark to actually play against you. Though, obviously doing this does buy her some trust with Emily in a spot where Sabiyah does decide to not target Emily in the following round. Though, to be fair, I don't know if that was already the plan by this point, to where if it was, I would say this is probably actually a kind of decent move to try to get her on your side. Though even what she later tries to do with that is also a strange move in itself, which is exemplified by the fact that Emily pretty openly distrusts her here, calling her out by mentioning the fact that there are only 3 votes at the last tribal, and Emily knowing that one of her fellow players, more than likely Sabiyah, are obviously lying to her. Though this did lead to some inconsistent content for Emily, where Caleb, again the guy that is propelling her development, ends up saying in confessional here that this feels like the old Emily coming back to the surface, which again is a curious confessional that really undermines Emily's story a bit here, in a position where it really doesn't play into anything, and this did feel like a strange addition to the show there. With that, let's start talking about Bello, who really got pretty minimal content in this episode. I mean, what we did get was a pretty big surge for Jake's edit, where we do see him blowing on the fire, only from the fall into it. Thankfully, not pulling a scoop-in, as you never want to go full scoop-in. But this ends up being used to really propel his relationship with Kendra, a relationship that I was assuming was going to play dividends within the game, especially post-merge, though that never really comes to be. But it does provide some good content for both Jake and Kendra here, with Kendra talking about now targeting Bruce, which along with that comes the typical confessional from Katurah about how annoying he is. But with that, again, again, just more of the same setup to a Bruce boot that doesn't matter as this tribe never goes to tribal. But we do end up spending a lot of time on Reba, where we do get a lot of focus on the resolution to the idol hunt, which seemingly coincides with the solidification of the Reba 4, where to start all off, we do see Austin and Drew digging for the idol right outside of camp, only for Dee to get content about being really close to Julie and also being suspicious of Austin and Drew, as she's proven right, as she ends up finding them digging, only for Drew to play it off as if it's nothing, which was a pretty bad look for Austin and Drew here, with them lying about having seen Sifu there, and that's what caused them to dig, with again Dee noticing something is off here and says it feels like she's catching a boyfriend cheating on her, to where, despite Austin later confessing to Dee and Julie about the advantage, he still ends up lying about when he found it, never being fully truthful to her here, with Dee also clocking that, along with the fact that she thinks that they never would have told her had they not catch them, which again constantly is proving Dee right in this scene, which by the end of this episode, I did end up jumping Dee up as my top contender, a spot that she ends up going back and forth with Emily for a lot of this season, though this was really the point in the season where I was fully on board with her as one of the most likely people to win the game. But we do end up seeing the 4 searching together now, with Julie and Dee being the ones that actually find the rope that leads to the ladder that they will end up using to break open the idol. Again, playing into this more elongated process of finding the idol, but here we do end up seeing Dee and Julie allow for Austin to find the idol himself, which you could certainly criticize this move, though I do think this early in the game, this was probably the right call, as obviously if you took the idol for yourself, you would think that Austin would start to suspect something, and at this point, it's way more useful as a tool to solidify your group, especially considering how open Austin is and willing to use this for the alliance as a whole. And we once again have Dee vocalizing this, making her come off as a methodical player here. But with Austin finding the first idol of the season, we do get to see the new idol rules, in that the idol does not have full power at first, where despite not having their vote until they find the idol themselves, once they do find the idol, they must now also give up their vote once again to make their idol valid until the merge, and then give up their vote again after that a second time to make it last until the final 5. Which, all this is just, again, like, why are we doing this? I mean, I know why we're doing this, and the fact that Jeff seems obsessed with the concept of having nowhere to hide and having dangerous fun, and to him, losing votes is dangerous fun, but to me, this just sucks. And to be fair, we never see it having a negative impact on this season, and it actually instead pays dividends by the end of this very episode. But again, it just feels like an unnecessary addition here to just limit the options even more by just having less votes available coming into the vote. Anyway, this episode does end up containing a reward challenge, which was a mostly boring challenge, though Caleb ends up winning it for Lulu. The only challenge OG Lulu ends up winning, to which they end up winning a tribe raid, which we've obviously seen this before, and it functions similarly how it worked in Survivor 43, and just like that season, they end up sending a salesman to the other tribe in Caleb, though they don't initially show what tribe they've decided on, leading to this pretty dumb fake out that again they typically do of showing both tribes thinking they're about to be raided, until it's revealed that they actually raided Reba, to where the content that Caleb gets here was not particularly great, where we do clearly see him being looked at as a pretty massive threat, which doesn't bode well for his position coming into the merge. But through this, we do also get an added wrinkle with this raid, in the fact that Caleb has the ability to divvy out a new advantage to a member of Reba, that being the goodwill advantage, an advantage that restores a lost vote, which I just find it so funny that we're literally at the point in Survivor where there are so many opportunities to lose your vote, that there needs to be a power to undo you losing your vote. But I mean, truth be told, I do think this aspect of there now being this kind of more fully formed vote economy is kind of an interesting concept that you can, again, just now lose and win back votes, which can lead to some interesting situations, though again, I do feel like more times than not, it just leads to the votes not having as many options as they could have. But really, this advantage still ends up being a pretty situational one, though one that is perfectly paired up with the Finder of the Beware Vantage, with this playing out pretty perfectly for the Reba 4, with Caleb ending up giving it to Drew, to where he obviously is going to use it on Austin down the road. And this once again supports Drew's game philosophy here of him being overtly honest, and how he does end up telling Caleb about his safety without power to gain trust, which again is pretty effective use of it, to where obviously coming into a merge, it's probably going to leak that he has it anyway. But back on Lulu, while Caleb is gone, we do end up seeing Sean and Sabiyah seemingly changing their minds about wanting to work with him, and again now deciding to work with Emily instead. A choice that comes off as pretty rash on the show, really coming out of nowhere, especially considering the frostiness between Emily and Sabiyah. And while I don't agree with this move, particularly due to the fact that Caleb is just such a massive shield for them coming into the merge, I do still understand why they thought they needed to make this move, with them picking up on the fact that Caleb was working on Emily and now thinking that he's building relationships with the other side that could harm them down the road. So again, I can understand the fact that he is looking like too big of a threat at this point, that he has too many options moving forward. But again, just trusting Emily with the fact that you're going to vote him out here is just all really sloppy. I mean, I think they would have been better off if they just tried to pull off a 2-1-1, convincing Caleb to vote for Emily while having Emily vote for Sabiyah still, while they end up voting for Caleb to take him out. As again, just letting Emily in on this plan gives Emily the leverage to use this against you, as we later see happen. And the entire concept of trusting Emily to begin with is really stupid, considering one of the points in why they distrust Caleb to begin with is due to the fact that he's getting close to Emily. So again, thinking that she wouldn't report this back to him did seem a bit misguided. Anyway, we then get to the immunity challenge, a pretty physical challenge here that culminates in a typical cube puzzle, with Lulu once again not doing that bad in the physical aspect of the challenge, only to then blow it at the puzzle. Though along the way, we do also get some more negative content for Bruce, with him being really abrasive in ordering people around during the challenge, to where Kelly talks about how annoyed she is at him, which ends up being kind of the start of Katurah being proved right about her annoyance at Bruce, with most people from this point onwards ending up agreeing with how Katurah felt during the entire season. But anyway, coming into Tribal, we do end up seeing that Sabiyah is pretty confident in the fact that Caleb is going home, but does realize that her vote might end up being really important here, to where she does decide that now is the time to get her idol. But obviously without fire at camp still, she decides to burn it at Tribal Council, aka in public, which I do question, like, why didn't she just do this last time? And I guess the answer is the fact that she wanted to hide the idol from Emily, but it's like, again, you're doing that this time anyway. Instead, she had to continuously lie to cover her tracks, which ends up backfiring on her here, where now, because she's going to do it in public anyway, she has to actually tell Emily about her idol, which in doing so, obviously reveals that Sabiyah had been lying to her earlier, which again, this is used as an excuse for why Emily realizes that she's on the bottom and ends up flipping back to Caleb. Though, I'll be honest, I kind of feel like more than likely this was already heading in that direction anyway, where Caleb had already talked about how ideally he would want to save Emily, and Caleb was already told that he was the decoy vote by Sabiyah. But also, when we do eventually see Emily tell Caleb that he is Sabiyah's target, the tone of that conversation was one that really did not feel like it was Caleb actually just now realizing that he needs to flip. Instead, felt like one where, again, they had already talked about this beforehand, and this was just more confirmation as to why Caleb should flip. And obviously for Caleb, this ends up being a self-preservation move here, the one that is pretty impressive. In fact, he does build this really strong bond with Emily, where she goes out of her way to save Caleb here. Though I will say for Emily herself, I do question the move a bit more, especially considering the fact that they were assuming that Sabiyah was going to have her vote by the time that the votes were cast, which means that was she willing to go to Rocks in this instance, as again, it would have been a 2-2 vote, and going to Rocks this early in the game is a very precarious position. Now obviously, yeah, she would have been the next to go had the tribe gone to Tribal again, had Caleb gone, especially if there's no swap the next round, which again, at this point, I don't think they were expecting a swap in the game. But again, just to go to Rocks this early does feel like a really difficult call to make, and one that I would typically side against in most instances, and really just take my shot at the fact that there would be either a swap or us not having to go to tribal again. But again, we do get a pretty great tribal here where right away we do end up seeing Sabaya putting her idol in the fire, which was funny to see how Jeff reacted in particular, to where it does feel like production never really fully thought this through, the concept of a tribe not having fire at camp to burn the idol, and through that never really envisioned the fact that someone would actually use the fire at tribal to secure their idol. And again, this ends up being a pretty fun scene, and we do get this funny kind of like entire operation surrounding it, to where Sabaya ends up pulling it out only for Sean to then pour water all over it. Though interestingly, we do see her not even bothering to look at the note that came with it until getting to the booth, where she learns that she has to give up her vote to give the idol more powers, which she obviously ends up doing, which feels like a bold move to be making at this point, where she really seemed to be extremely sure that she had Emily on her side, where by doing this, she obviously ironically ends up voting herself out of the game, with her turning what would have been a 2-2 vote into a 2-1 vote, where she gets voted out by Caleb and Emily, which again, I get her mindset here, where she does think that she might need this idol for later in the game, especially due to her being very low on numbers moving forward in the game, and banking on the fact that obviously Emily is truthful to her. But I do feel like this is such a risky vote to do this with, where obviously if she didn't risk her vote here, she just outright wins this vote through her having an idol to then play on herself, and the only opportunity that the idol is valid. And again, when you're on such a small tribe with such former hostility between you and Emily, it's like I do feel like it felt misguided to give up her vote here and not just play the idol on herself. And truth be told, again, like the reality is I don't fault her for giving up her vote. The thing I do fault her for is not playing the idol. As again, like giving up her vote is probably the correct call to make here, as no matter what, your idol is still valid for this tribal, and this just opens up the opportunity of you being able to gauge the other players and potentially keep your idol. So again, I just feel like she should have just played the idol no matter what at this point. So again, I get why she did it, and it obviously does lead to better TV, the fact that she does lose her vote, as again, this is just a fun way for her to go out of the game here. Despite again it actually being one of the few times that taking away someone's vote does lead to a more interesting result here, where we do get this great moment of Sabaya asking the others when the idols are called on if they're good, to which Caleb obviously says they are, with this response essentially ending up saving his game. Obviously she doesn't end up playing the idol, and we do get this great blindside with great blindside faces from both Sabaya and Sean. Again, just overall like a really fun tribal here, with the vote off in particular being one of the best of the season. But with that, we obviously lose Sabaya, who was definitely one of the bigger pre-merge characters on this season. Someone that, considering how strong of a player she came off in the first 2 episodes, was a bit of a shock to see her get taken out this early on in the game, where she really just feels like this big what could have been, where had she been able to make it deeper into the game, or really just had been placed on any other tribe, I do think she would have been a very dangerous player, one that could have made a very deep run. So on this specific tribe, she was obviously put in a more precarious spot due to the fact that they constantly lost challenges. And even despite that, again, she was kind of running the game until this tribal. So again, I do think as a whole, though, I do look at her as a bit of a sloppy player. Again, I think her trusting Emily as much as she did is a bit sloppy. Her putting herself so much out in front is obviously not ideal. Her obviously not playing the idol is pretty bad. So again, there's definitely things to criticize, but I do think I come out of this looking at her as one of the better pre-merge boots here, particularly due to the fact that, again, she kind of gets taken out in a very wonky circumstance, to where had her idol just been a normal idol as in most seasons, she at least gets a tie here, to where there's at least a chance Emily doesn't decide to go to Rocks for the sake of Caleb. So I'll say, like, again, I do think she's a bit screwed over by the fact that she had to lose her vote to keep her idol anyway, but still, again, is a pretty mixed bag of a player. But with that, we then get to episode 4, an episode that starts with Lulu returning to camp, with Sean now being surprised at him being on the bottom and feeling left out with his closest ally and Sabaya being gone, something that I do think plays a major factor into what ends up happening by the end of this episode. But almost immediately we then get to the tribe's gathering, where we do get a lot of shocked reactions from Sabaya having been voted out, along with some strange questions from Jeff, with him telling Emily, I know you take some perverse enjoyment out of the other tribes not knowing what's going on, which is like, what a weird thing to say. And we do get some funny reactions to this question, with Kelly later turning this phrase against against him, as it is in this moment where Jeff does end up revealing that they are swapping, being the first formal tribe swap of the new era, and it was sorely missed, where I'm extremely happy that the swap is finally back in the rotation. Though something I don't love about this one in particular is the fact that we're still swapping into 3 tribes of 5, because Jeff just loves smaller tribes for whatever reason. Again, just feels like it's limiting the total possibilities of what can happen at each vote. But we do end up getting a pretty strange tribe breakdown here, with the 3 Lulus ending up being separated across the 3 tribes here, with Emily getting swapped into a perfect position of her being on a tribe with 2 from the other 2 tribes, meaning that she essentially becomes the swing vote, where Caleb ends up remaining on Lulu, but ends up going there with 4 other Bellos, while Sean ends up being swapped to Reba alongside 4 other Rebas, putting both of them in pretty precarious spots, being the lone outsider against what you would assume would be a strong group of 4. Again, I just would have much rather had 2 tribes here, though straight up I was not really expecting it. But I guess something else I should mention here is the fact that from post-game press, we did learn that Brando actually got an advantage at the swap here, to where he ended up not opening it until after they had gone back to camp, though at that point it was strangely taken back by production, which seems strange. I mean, if it was something that he was supposed to have played at the swap gathering itself, then like why wouldn't they just tell him to immediately open it? To where the entire story around this feels a bit weird, but I do think this could be an interesting idea, especially if it is this advantage that allows you to swap people around on other tribes. That obviously lessens the randomness of a tribe swap. I do think this would be an interesting idea to see them try to execute, which again, if they had been trying to do it this time, I would expect them to try to do it again at some point down the road. Though if this is actually the way they try to execute it on this season, and to not make it something that was told to the player they must read at this moment is kind of dumb. But as for the tribes themselves, the new Bella probably ends up being the tribe that we get the least amount of focus on of these 3 new tribes, though obviously we do get a lot of focus around Emily in particular, with this progressing her personal story of her talking about how she now needs to play low key and needs to be strategic about how she presents herself, obviously having learned from Caleb, to which we do end up seeing that Austin and Drew take a liking to her, with Drew saying that she's not as mean as she was built up to be, and I guess she's pretty normal. And again, all of this being this great Journey style edit for her. But something strange about the content here is that despite Emily being set up as a swing vote, we don't actually even get to see the other side of this swing, with the OG Bello in Kendra and Brando not even being on this episode, which was pretty damning to both of their edits. Not even just in terms of winner prospects, but also in terms of winning out in this battle with Austin and Drew, where when again their side of the story isn't even told until it's absolutely necessary, it does make it feel like the other side of the story is a lot more relevant, making it pretty clear to me that Emily was always going to side with Austin and Drew, with it clearly setting up the importance of Emily's relationships with them. That again felt like a pretty poor editing choice here that did lessen the suspense of the following episode. But with that, we then go to the new Lulu tribe, who do get a sizable amount of content here, despite the fact that they don't go to tribal. Where first off, after arriving at the beach, we do instantly see Bruce breaking down with the reveal that he's now back on Tika Beach, where he obviously was medevac the previous season, to where we do get this nice little moment for him, where he gets emotional having seen the spot where he got medevac from. But also here we do get the continuation of the Bruce and Katurah rivalry, where we do end up having Katurah openly asking Caleb about what Brandon told them about the journey that Bruce went on, again right in front of Bruce, and also not allowing him to speak, making it very clear that she's anti-Bruce. And again, this was just all poor play from Katurah, especially considering the fact that again she's doing this in the public right in front of Bruce. It's like, why are you doing this? But also it's like, what benefit does this really give to Katurah in the game moving forward, where at this point you have to assume that Bruce has some sort of advantage anyway. So I don't know what intel she was really thinking she was going to get here that would have greatly impacted her game, to which again this just felt like sloppy play from her. But the remainder of the content on this tribe did largely revolve around Caleb, with him trying to find his place within the Bello group, with us essentially going one-on-one and showing his relationships with each member of the tribe in a way that did feel very reminiscent to me of how Vetus was portrayed in Blood vs. water after the swap there, and unsurprisingly, they end up having pretty similar trajectories. But we do first see him walk off with Jake clearly wanting to work with him. Now, I'm not sure if he would have been willing to flip on OG Bello at this point to work with him, but I do feel like Jake ends up being one of Caleb's bigger lifelines later on. But is here where we do also get some pretty fun Jake content, with him having this confessional about how he's ready to jump ship and a good thing he's a good swimmer, which just ends up cracking himself up, which was pretty humorous to see there. But along with that, we end up seeing Bruce trying to pull in Caleb as well, alongside Kelly, to which we end up getting the establishment of the Bruce and Kelly relationship, with Bruce continuously telling Kelly that she's his number one, only for her to not believe it. But while they are pulling Caleb in, we do end up seeing Katurah watching them from afar, once again being upset at Bruce for talking to him, and ends up pulling him over herself, telling him that everything Bruce has told him is a lie, to which Caleb seems to fully believe this, with him being happy that someone has finally told him what is actually going on. Though with that, we do get some great editing here, with us seeing Katurah going on a rant about Bruce, which ends up getting montaged through, with her going on and on and on, which again just plays into how fun the rivalry was on the show. But with that, we eventually get to an immunity challenge, which ends up being a new challenge of everyone getting into a cage and carrying that cage onto shore while they're inside it, and then shooting baskets from inside it as well. Again, a strange challenge, but one that does lead to a pretty funny Jeff moment of him having to constantly yell at each tribe of where exactly to put the cage. Anyway, Caleb and Austin end up winning it for their tribes, while Sifu seemingly did a lot of the work for the Reba tribe, only for him to suck at the shooting, which cost them the win anyway. But with that ends up meaning that Emily and Caleb end up winning their first immunity challenges of the season, while Sean now becomes the only person left in the game to have not won an immunity challenge, to which he ends up saying that he feels deflated from that, which again might play a factor later on. But strangely here, despite Reba going into tribal, we do actually get a post-immunity scene from Lulu, where you see Caleb being happy that he finally has Flint on his tribe, only for us to get a prank from Bruce of him pretending to have lost the Flint, and we obviously then cut to Katurah in that moment, to her just shaking her head in confessional, which is just a funny scene. But with that, let's finally cut to the Reba side of things, where initially we do end up seeing Sean in pretty high spirits, talking about how he needs to find cracks, and we do see him instantly bonding with J-Maya, who ends up having a standout episode here after having one of the quietest edits up to this point, though not necessarily for good reason, with her spending the entire episode trying to save Sean, only for her to technically get the votes to keep him, until she ultimately fails at saving Sean anyway. And even beyond that, she ends up spending this entire episode trying to get Sifu out, which, I mean, it did seem like coming into this tribe that relationship between J-Maya and Sifu was pretty fractured, but considering the two are the only two outside of the core alliance on the OG Reba, they do kind of need each other in the game, but instead they were just directly coming after each other, which obviously seems misguided, with the two of them seemingly being aloof to the true dynamics on the original Reba tribe, with Jay thinking that she's in an all-girls alliance, when in reality she's simply just a step above Sifu on the pecking order. But beyond that, this is where we do get the start of this negative tinge for Dee's edit, with her being worried about Sean having an idol, and ends up digging through his bag, only to then find nothing there, to which we end up seeing her methodically study the way that he tied up his bag to begin with, which is style of content ends up being part of a trend moving forward of her getting these more villainous camp scenes of her doing these underhanded things, but seemingly getting away with them, with her being portrayed at doing so with tact. Now we do end up seeing a lot of campaigning for the vote here, with J-Maya obviously wanting Sifu out, though we do see Julie talking about keeping Sifu around, particularly for the challenges, and her also voicing her worry about Jay's relationship with Sean, where I do feel like Julie comes off pretty rational in this situation, but she does technically fail to get her way coming into tribal, with Dee siding with getting Sifu out and her obviously going alongside that, which really just seems to be the story of Julie, of her seemingly having a different agenda to her core alliance at points, but proceeds to fail to get her way even within her core alliance, where again for Dee as well, I really don't get why they even wanted Sifu out at this point, where it felt like a lot of Sifu's target came from the sus that there was around him potentially having an idol, when Dee and Julie should know that he doesn't have an idol. Where, again, Sifu never went on a journey for him to get something there. While beyond that, again, they know that Austin has the Reba idol, and they've been on Reba the entire time. So it's kind of dumb to even think that Sifu might have an idol, which kind of nullifies the entire purpose of taking him out. But we do see them informing Sean that he will be staying, and we do literally see them saying that they'll be lying at Tribal and that they'll be talking about how they're Reba strong, which seemed to be there just to make Sean's later decision come off as even more irrational. But here, despite Sifu seeming to be dead in the water coming into Tribal, he doesn't get much content in this episode, really just coming off as pretty aloof to the other Reba members coming for him, to where while he does voice some doubts coming into Tribal, that just felt more like him going through the motions of just having to distrust everybody than him actually believing in that. But obviously we then get to Tribal, which ends up being a very strange one here, where the initial tone to it is actually a pretty happy-go-lucky one, where Sean seems to be making jokes with Sifu, but it seems like the switch here is when Jeff ends up asking Sean what he got out of the experience, which is something that Jeff has asked a lot of the potential boots in previous episodes, really just saying it to anyone that's in danger, more so than them being guaranteed to go home, something that, again, Sean should know himself, as in the previous Tribals he's attended, he's seen both Emily and Brandon being asked the same question, but it is in this instance that we do hear Sean's backstory, him talking about growing up in conservative world, being a Mormon, and trying to fit into the straight Mormon lifestyle, though now obviously wants to reclaim that lost time, and talks about being ready for adventure of a lifetime with his husband back home, and all this seemingly being wrapped up in this really touching moment here, until he proceeds to say that this is why he wants them to vote him out, which really comes out of nowhere on this show, and seemingly came out of nowhere on the island as well, where this literally seemed to be a last-second decision from Sean, especially considering the fact that he was clearly trying to stay at the very beginning of this Tribal, and again, to me, his decision to quit here is just completely nonsensical. Again, if he is quitting to be with his husband, as he claims, and that won't be happening, as pre-jury boots are held until the end of filming unless you're willing to break the rules and lose your stipend in the process. But I really do think the main reason why he ends up quitting here is more so from the fact that he just seems so beaten down by this experience. Again, he had never won immunity, he had this terrible camp experience, he had never really gained much traction in the game, and has also now lost his closest ally in Sabaya, while also being on the bottom of his tribe. So where I do feel like a lot of the reason why he ends up quitting here is due to him kind of just losing the will to continue on in the game and not thinking there was much of a chance for him in the long haul, with this feeling like a bit like him taking his ball and going home and him wanting to go out on his own terms, which again did annoy me more so than the Hannah quit in episode 1, where again I do think there are some fundamental differences between the two. Obviously this happening later on in the game, to which obviously he's become more of a cog in how the game is operating. And by him quitting here, he really is screwing over all the women that just went out on a limb to try to save him, while also guaranteeing that Lulu's almost extinct coming into the merge. While beyond that, I do also feel like Sean really just didn't own it here either, where it felt like he was just making excuses for why he's quitting the game to try to sell it as it's because he's missing his husband, when again I think the reality is that he just makes a completely irrational decision here that he openly regrets in his exit press, to where this largely just felt like a moment of weakness from him that seemed to put him in this illogical state of mind, and being pretty different from the Hannah situation, to where again Hannah knew that she couldn't handle it and to this day doesn't regret the fact that she quit, while Sean obviously does, because he realizes how rash of a decision it ended up being. But obviously this does lead to a lot of shock from pretty much everyone there. I mean, outside of Sifu, as again he was thinking he was going out anyway, but clearly Jeff is annoyed by this, clearly more mad at Sean here than he was at Hannah, with him essentially telling him that he's engineering a quit, and Jeff clearly is still frustrated with him even at the time of the airing of the episode. But strangely, we do get to see them still going through with the vote here. Again, something I don't fully get why they did here and not for when Hannah quit the game. I mean, maybe they were more unsure on if this was a plan from Sean, or maybe it was just how abrupt all of it felt, but we do get some interesting ramifications from going through with the vote here, where despite knowing that Sean wants to quit, Dee still decides to try to get the women to hold strong here in voting out Sifu anyway, which I do think is misguided here. I mean, I don't get why Dee is so gung-ho on needing Sifu out in this instance, where the potential of losing both Sean and Sifu here would just completely doom this tribe for the following challenge, while also with Sean ending up getting voted out here, her one vote for Sifu ends up being revealed despite the fact that Sifu is obviously remaining in the game, obviously making him aware of the target on his back if they go to a tribal again, which is also dumb considering the fact that they had literally talked about targeting him because they thought he had an idol, which just would guarantee the fact that he plays the idol then, which obviously is an argument for why you should take him out now, though again at this point you still have J Maya as a potential scapegoat to try to get Sifu to put his vote on as well, or it's really just felt like them pissing off Sifu for really no true benefit. But Sifu getting voted for here does lead to a pretty funny moment of Sifu saying who voted Sifu as his name comes out, which again is just funny to see him refer to himself in the third person. And as Sean leaves, we do end up seeing Sean again screwing over the women once again as he ends up revealing to Sifu that he didn't end up voting for her, really just exposing the women's plans once again. But with that, again, we lose Sean, who, I mean, again, I've kind of said my piece on him. I do feel like his quit here was one that, again, did annoy me more than Hannah's. Again, not to the degree that it felt like most of the fan base seemed to really hate on both Hannah and Sean, but I do think his quit here just did not make much sense to me in the slightest, and really just felt like him making excuses for why he wanted to quit the game. But that being said, again, I do actually like Sean. I mean, Sean did come off as a pretty fun personality, where while his edit was definitely one of the quieter ones of the bunch, he did have a really fun energy in the confessional, and even the way he was talking at Tribal was just really fun. And mixing down the fact that, again, I think he has a really sympathetic backstory. He is also, again, a competent player, seemingly, sort of before the fact that he quits here. He does, again, convince the tribe to take out one of their own over him, along with the fact that he seemed to be running the original Lulu tribe with Zabaya initially. Like, I think Sean is actually a pretty solid player, particularly for a pre-merge boot. But again, he does end up quitting just completely out of nowhere, to where, sadly, that does end up tainting my overall opinions of him on the show. But now for episode 5, which ends up probably being my least favorite of the pre-merge episodes here, where it had seemed like up to this point the show had been putting a concerted effort into fixing the editing issues of the previous New Era seasons. Where on this season, it felt like every vote was properly explained, with us understanding the point of views of all the players involved, while also reducing the number of sob stories and having less time focused solely around journeys, though this episode felt way more in line with the typical New Era editing style that did lessen my enjoyment of the episode as a whole, though it still had some pretty interesting aspects to it. Now, we do start off on the Reba tribe, where we obviously get an awkward return to camp, where Sifu clearly wants to start talking about what happened at Tribal and figure out who voted for him, only for Dee and Julie to say that they're not ready yet, with Dee in particular looking really pissed in this scene, which again should have been this really big giveaway for Sifu at what was going on here, where again this clearly felt like them trying to buy time in order to figure out what lie they were going to say to him. But this is where we do get confessionals from Dee and Julie, obviously being upset at how Sean has ruined their game, with Dee in particular getting some content in reaction to it, with her explaining why she went for Sifu the previous episode, and says that it was putting her heart aside and playing the game, once again making her come off as this methodical player here, while also giving her personal content that felt mostly irrelevant to the events of the game, with it essentially being used to further trash on Sean again for quitting, saying that she didn't come from a family of quitters, and obviously setting herself up as this direct antithesis to Sean, which in itself is really good content for her. But beyond this, we do see Sifu doing a recon here, though obviously everyone ends up telling him that they voted for Sean as expected. Though with him not feeling safe, he does end up pulling out a fake idol here that the women seem to eat up in thinking that this is actually a real idol, which again, from Dee and Julie's perspective, I don't get how. Again, this doesn't really make sense, but Sifu does a pretty decent job in selling it here, and it was a pretty strong looking fake idol, to give him some credit, though strangely this is the only time we do see him attempt to use this fake idol on the show, despite there being other opportune times for him to do so, which again, we'll talk about that later. But this is where we start to get some strange content coming from the J Maya Sifu relationship, relationship where we see them having a conversation that has him just randomly bringing up the Tai Chi training routine push hands and says it teaches you how to fight and it's one of his favorite things to do, which J. Maya thinks it's him trying to intimidate her, which is used to set up this like animosity between the two, where Sifu just seemingly assumes that it was J. Maya that voted for him, which obviously it wasn't, but all this was just super strange. And what's even stranger is the fact that J. Maya seems okay with taking the blame here, where we see her coming up with a plan to make herself the decoy vote and for Dee and Julie to then go to Sifu and pretend like they're upset at J. Maya for voting for him and make him feel comfortable so that he doesn't end up using his idol. And I mean, this has to be one of the dumbest plans I've ever heard, where again, like J. Maya thinks that Sifu has an idol in this plan. It's where again, if he uses that idol, she's done. Now, to be fair, it probably was going to happen anyway, as again, Sifu was probably going to vote for J. Maya even without this plan going through, but just to invite Dee and Julie to further throw you under the bus seem really ridiculous here. And the worst part of it all for me is that this further gives no incentive to Dee and Julie to actually keep you around, where if Sifu is under the impression that J. Maya was the one that betrayed him, then this is just the perfect opportunity for Dee to just now get rid of J. Maya to cover her tracks and also potentially flush an idol and also just outright keep her safe in the process as well. And like, it really just feels like this is something that just completely falls into Dee's lap here, which is again funny considering she's the one that caused all this chaos to begin with. Again, like to me, this plan like really just further alerts Dee to the fact that she doesn't actually need J. Maya around anymore, which I mean, again, to be fair, would have probably been the plan anyway, but again, I just think it makes it even more clear once J. Maya goes through this plan, which makes it seem even that more misguided. I'm now talking about the Lulu tribe. Their content starts off with a pretty massive segment surrounding Jake, where he prepares to go fishing with Bruce, only for him to collapse once again, with Jake being pissed that it keeps on happening to him, which did bring up some worries here about him potentially being medevac, though obviously that hasn't come to be. But this does later transition us to this pretty great personal content from him, of him talking about his problems with binge eating and him finally facing his problems and him spending 2 years working out to prepare himself for the show, which again, really made him come off as sympathetic here and essentially made him the most likely winner out of those that weren't particularly likely to win. But it really makes it feel like the edit is trying really hard to make you like Jake. But once again, obviously we get a good chunk of Caleb content here, where we once again get a check-in with each of his relationships, seeing him check in on Jake and also starting an alliance with Kelly that doesn't end up mattering, though it strangely seems to be used to prop up both of them as players, despite the fact that they're both early merge boots, with Caleb getting to talk a lot about his superpowers in building relationships, while Kelly gets propped up with Caleb calling her the best player on the tribe, to which Kelly obviously gets her typical game body content here that just feels so surface level, to where despite Kelly being a top contender for most people at this point in the season, I was pretty much out on her. Again, her edit just felt straight up boring with no true depth to it. So I mean, while yes, we do see a lot of where she is in the game and we know that she's playing the middle, I feel like we know nothing about her as a person. And along with the fact that she loses her closest ally in this episode in Brando, and we hear nothing about her reaction to that, and also mixing that with a certain other scene that we'll talk about later in the episode, it really just sunk her winning chances to me, where I personally thought she had no chance of winning. But also here we do get to see more of Caleb's relationship with Katurah, where we do get to see her looking for an idol, only for the entire tribe to catch her, to where we see Caleb warning her about that, during which Katurah ends up getting some pretty damning content here, with Kelly calling her a hot mess and a sloppy player. They're also saying she understands why Bruce is hesitant to work with her, which felt like one of the few instances on this season where Katurah is shown to be in the wrong in relation to her relationship with Bruce, which obviously leads to more Bruce-Katurah content, with them arguing over push presence, with her saying that he spews crap. And we also get this segment of Katurah wanting to eat the last papaya, only for Bruce to think that that's a ridiculous idea, saying that this is the dumbest thing, only for him to then stop himself from going further. But then following this, we then cut to Bruce being upset at Caleb for not getting firewood, to which Caleb starts to now be annoyed at Bruce, where it felt like this was content of, again, them supporting Katurah's point of view here. But now let's talk about the Bello tribe, where the content here starts with a montage montage of everyone talking about how much they want food, with Austin in particular talking about how starving he is, which I wonder if that'll be relevant. But this does have Kendra getting content as well about her eating a worm, which has them really propping her up as this big character, which is kind of strange considering she does get one of the more middling edits of the season. But this is where we finally do get to see the Kendra and Brando side of this tribe, which again was clearly going to be the losing tribe coming into this episode. But here we do get to see a lot from Brandon's point of view in particular, thus seeing him trying to bond with Drew over Pokemon in a scene that I just found really strange, in that they're like solely focusing on Brando and Drew, despite the fact that Emily's clearly there participating in the conversation. Yet the edit just ignores her here, with this obviously just being more of a means to explain the fracture between Drew and Brando, setting up why they end up going for each other by the end of the episode, along with the fact of setting up Brando as this threat, with him extending beyond just his relationship with Kendra, which obviously Kendra was also doing, though we just don't see it on the show for whatever reason. Though with that, I guess we should talk about some context that seemed to be missing from the episodes that we learned in post-game press, in the fact that Kendra did seemingly have a very good relationship with Emily, again stemming back from the twist in the premiere where she bonded with Emily on the original Lulu tribe. It does seem like that was a relationship that Kendra seemed to think would carry weight coming into this swap here, to where it seems like that is the reason why Brando and Kendra are really confident in having Emily on their side, despite the fact that we don't ever really see them doing that much work in trying to pull her in, despite her being the swing vote, which for Brando in particular I do think is pretty poor play here, where again, despite people talking about how Brando was swap screwed because of how good of a position he was on in the original Bello tribe, I personally don't really agree with that notion, as again, it's not like he came into this swap with no chance of saving himself. He actually came in with the better odds of saving himself, due to the fact that he was tied to Kendra, with Kendra being tied to Emily. He really ends up just dropping the ball and allowing Drew and Austin to pull her away from him, instead of him doing a lot more active work that he could have done in getting her on his side, where it really feels like he just chalks it all up to Kendra having that relationship from earlier on in the game, which again is just simply not enough to keep him in particular safe here, which I do think is a major knock against Brando's game for me. But again, we do see Brando talking about how he actually does want to work with Drew, to where he does offer him a Nerds alliance, only for Drew to shut this down to his face, which did seem ridiculous. Now, practically, I can understand to a degree why he does this, as obviously Emily is there and he doesn't want to spook Emily into thinking that he is shifty by making all these side deals, especially when a lot of his game is making these strives into portraying himself as this honest and loyal player. But again, I do think the conventional wisdom is obviously just to accept whatever alliance you're offered, and overall I do think this is a bad look for Drew Edgicly, to where his shutting down of his alliance with Brando, again an alliance that he calls garbage, is countered by Brando stating that he was being genuine in wanting to work with him, but now that he's turned down my alliance, I have to work against him. Again, making it very clear that the edit is portraying this as a mistake, which is pretty bad for Drew from an editing perspective. But anyway, we then get to the immunity challenge, which ends up being a pretty typical obstacle course that ends with the slingshot portion, where we do end up seeing Reba doing surprisingly well here, with them easily winning and Bello coming in last, unsurprisingly considering their content up to this point, especially considering how much they were hyping up Emily's decision that she was going to have to make, which again, I wonder who she's going to choose. But this is where we do get the reveal that there is a journey here, one that Reba gets to decide who goes, to where J. Maya ends up winning rock, paper, scissors, and she ends up picking Kelly to go alongside her, as she feels bad for her for sitting out of the challenge, I guess, alongside Austin, to which she openly says that she's picking him to get info from the other side, to which Austin rightfully says hell no to that. But again, why would J. Maya say this? Like, this is just furthering the target on Reba's back, being particularly bad for Drew and Austin, where had they not done the good work they had already done on Emily, this should have really sent Emily to the opposing side, thinking that Reba was much closer than Bello in this situation. And again, it's all really funny too, considering J. Maya is saying this despite the fact that she's on the bottom of her tribe and just doesn't know it. But anyway, the journey itself does have them climbing to the top of the mountain, where at that point they have to face the dilemma, having to choose between sandwiches, which obviously plays into Austin's previous talking about wanting food, or an amulet, which functions similarly to how it functions for R42. And I mean, this should have been a clear-cut choice. I mean, as Austin correctly points out here, you should pick the sandwiches. I mean, the amulet sucks. It's essentially just putting a bullseye on your back with the 3 involved here. Despite, again, like having the typical talk about, oh, this makes us work together, it obviously instead just does the opposite and incentivizes you to turn on each other in order to be the last one standing of the bunch and in turn get an idol in exchange for that. And we do see Austin, again, clearly not wanting to do this, recognizing this fact, though we do see Jay really insistent right away, leaving Kelly as the decision maker to where she decides to go for it, which again just seems extremely misguided here. And I mean, to be fair to all of them, obviously Austin has less incentive to go through this as he already has an idol in his possession and isn't desperate for more advantages. But clearly this was the wrong call, and this does also clearly set up this rivalry between Austin and Jay and Kelly, with him wanting revenge over his sandwich, which is a humorous storyline, but one that made it very clear that Austin was going to outlast the other two, which again further sank Kelly's chances in particular. But back on the Belo tribe, we obviously get more content about who is Emily gonna vote for, which again should have been obvious. Though despite that, we do get some drama coming into the vote surrounding this tension between Emily and Drew, though again it felt pretty superfluous, where we do see Emily warning Drew here that he is Belo's target, only for him to seemingly believe Brando instead, who had just gone up to him and, interestingly, like Emily did with Sabaya, attempted to give Drew his shot in the dark to make him agree to vote for Kendra instead of him, which, I mean, to be fair, is a pretty decent play from Brando if he had been able to make it go through, though Drew, being Drew, turns it down anyway, and obviously it doesn't really end up working in his favor by the end of it. And to be fair, I also feel like this could have easily just exposed Brando as a rat, to where had this info gotten back to Kendra, this could have further synced his chances. But this does lead to Emily confronting Brando over how he's actually voting, to which Brando here ends up lying and saying that it was actually Drew's idea to vote for Kendra, not his, which again Emily seemingly believes and openly tells Drew that she doesn't believe him, which I will say seems like pretty questionable play from Emily's point of view to openly show distrust in him, to which Drew ends up being pretty incensed here, to where he then talks about how he has to count on Austin to save him in this situation, which is conveniently where Austin returns to camp, and is where I feel like it became pretty clear that Austin is the better player of the two and probably the person that's playing the best game on the island up to this point, which in essence I do think did harm Drew's winning chances for me, to where again it once again just had this episode kind of focusing on all of Drew's failures during the round, only for him to have Austin come in to repair it, where again we do see Austin earning back Emily's trust by using the info about the amulet to his advantage, clearly coming off as the reason why Emily ends up sticking with him by the end of it. But again, none of it really mattered anyway, as again Drew had the safety without power and Austin would have had an idol in the case they needed it, to where no matter what it felt like Brando was a goner coming into Tribal anyway. So again, Tribal ends up being pretty boring here, though we do end up seeing Emily kind of return to her old ways of fighting back against Drew's comment of saying that you're betraying a real person, not a chess piece, which again feels like something she would have done on day one. But either way, we did get to the vote where Austin ends up sacrificing his vote only to then use the goodwill advantage anyway, and it ends up being a pretty basic Brando vote off here, though with that we do get a pretty great reaction from Kendra in particular, who continues to give really great reactions throughout the rest of the season. But again, with that we lose Brando, who I think is sadly probably going to be one of the most forgettable people from this season. I think he's someone that, again, there's not really much of note coming from him. I mean, he gets one of the quieter edits of the season. His boot is one that, again, came off as pretty straightforward. And again, in comparison to, like, again, the likes of Hannah and Sean, at least they have the quits to where, I mean, while they won't be remembered fondly, again, they probably will at least be remembered. While I feel like Brando just, again, did not really do much on this season to be remembered. Though despite that, again, I do think Brando comes off as a pretty competent player. I mean, he did seem to play the middle pretty well on the original Belo tribe. And while, again, I don't think he played the swap particularly well, I do feel like there definitely were some interesting ideas from him, to where I think it is a shame that he does go out here, because I do think he would have been a very interesting player to see down the road, potentially very innovative player, but one that, again, we're never really going to get to see. But with that, we then get to episode 6, the merge/mergatory episode that many people were talking about as an all-time great merge episode here. And while I definitely think it was good, I do think people a bit overreacted to it, though I do think the back half of the episode in particular was really great. Though I will say that this was also the point in the season where the Easter eggs in the intro did really bother me, as the Easter egg for this episode ends up being a shot of the shot in the dark, which makes it obvious what's going to happen in this episode, and giving me no suspense on whether or not Caleb was going to be saved, as obviously he was going to, as why else would they show the shot in the dark there? I mean, obviously it was going to be because we were going to get the first successful shot in the dark play. But anyway, before the merge itself, we do get some camp life scenes beforehand, starting off on Bello, where we obviously see the return to camp, with Kendra being upset and devastated at Emily flipping on her and wanting revenge on Emily, a storyline that doesn't lead to anything. Though despite Kendra's harsh feelings for her, we do see Emily seemingly not picking up on them, saying that she would have expected her to be more upset when, again, she was actually that upset. Again, all of which being kind of a bad look for Emily here, and her coming off as a bit unaware in this instance, even though it also is paired with some decent content for Emily of her talking about this being the first time in the game where she felt brought into an alliance over being dragged or manipulated, which feels ironic, as I do feel like she's being dragged and manipulated in this instance. But through that, I do think it makes it pretty telling where her true allegiances lie. For while she does have a throwaway line at a point in this episode of saying that Caleb is her number one, I do feel like it becomes more clear at this point that she is definitely siding with the Rebas over him. But anyway, we then cut to the Lulu tribe, where we see the tribe minus Katurah going on an idol hunt, with Bruce ending up finding the Beware Vantage here, revealing that the idol is underneath the shelter, which is pretty easy to get, which again, I don't love how unbalanced the difficulty of finding the idols are, especially after the initial batch, though to be fair, that's always been an issue with the new era. But we do get this fun scene of the entire tribe going on this heist and trying to get the idol without Katurah noticing, leading to Jake making up a story about having lost his ring, and that's why everyone's searching through the shelter, which is finally something that ends up backfiring on him, with this further isolating Katurah in the following episode. But it is in this moment where we do finally have the boat arrive to take him to the merge, leading to Bruce having to do this last second scramble to find the idol, which he eventually does. Well, this is where we cut back to Reba, with them learning about the others, joining them there, to which we do get another funny / sad moment of J. Maya wanting to make a sign to welcome everyone to the camp, only for Julie to say that she has no energy, and us then cutting to J. Maya making the sign herself, which, I mean, to be fair, is pretty indicative of her game, but also just kind of a sad moment. But I also feel like this scene does a lot to set up J. Maya as the potential boot here, and her saying that it's a triumph just to get here, and that everything up to this point was a verse while the chorus is coming, which definitely felt like it had an ironic tone to it. Where, I mean, while, yeah, you can interpret that as, okay, this could be the start of like an Erica style trajectory, again, it felt very much like, no, this is leading to her boot. But anyway, the players end up merging at the Reba camp, where we do instantly see a confessional from Dee, talking about how happy she is to see that both Austin and Drew made it through the previous round, being a good sign for Dee's edit, with her getting the first introductory confessional of the merge, but also obviously further establishing how important this Reba 4 alliance will be for down the road. But through that, we then proceed to get more negative content for J. Maya, with Austin telling his alliance what happened at the journey, which I guess J. Maya never told Dee and Julie, which again feels like sloppy play from her. But beyond that, we once again get Austin talking about wanting revenge for his sandwich, which again made the later result pretty obvious here, even though I don't even really understand why they keep on wanting J. Maya out here. And they keep on talking about her as a cutthroat player and a threat and someone that's gonna flip on them. But there seemingly is like no real basis towards any of that, where we see none of that in J. Maya's portrayal here, with her seemingly being pretty loyal to the other Rebas, especially the Reba women. So I really don't get why they specifically want to make this move. Though for Austin, I do feel like there's at least like some merit to it. Again, we do get him explaining this rationale, where he ends up talking about wanting to get rid of J. Maya to find a target that everyone can get behind, so that he can hide the fact that he's going to sacrifice his vote to not put a bullseye on his back when he gets a fully powered idol. Again, a rationale that I can get a bit more behind, even though, again, I still feel like targeting someone on your own side is surely not the optimal play here. Though, to be fair, it almost ends up working out for him despite that. And finally, kind of against his wishes, it almost ends up working out for him despite that. And also, to be fair, I mean, really, that criticism is the criticism I have of like almost everybody in the early merge phase of this game. But beyond that, we also end up seeing Emily and Bruce's first interaction, with her instantly apologizing to him, to where we then hear from Caleb, with him further supporting her arc of talking about how much she's coming into her own, but also recommitting to her being his number one ally, which, again, we never really see pay much dividends in the post-merge here. But we do see them agree to work with the Rebas for the upcoming round, which, again, for Emily seemed to be a more long-term plan, while for Caleb, he clearly talks about going back and forth between the groups, to which he's instantly caught in doing so. To where, straight up, I do think Caleb's game here is one that was definitely harmed by the overall meta of the show at this point, where obviously it's become very well known that the tribe coming into the merge down in numbers on a 3-tribe season typically becomes the swings and these power brokers in the post-merge phase of the game, where mixing that meta with the fact that Bruce obviously knows what happened on Survivor 44 with the Tika 3, I would not be shocked if that did play a major factor into why Caleb gets targeted here, especially with Bruce being really gung-ho against Caleb from the very start of this round, with him talking about how Caleb is this mastermind, while beyond that he also continues his distrust of Emily despite the fact that they seem to repair things, to where it really just felt like Bruce was going after the Lulus from the very beginning here. But coming into the immunity challenge, we do get Bruce being set up as this massive target, with him realizing that no one is talking to him, which again might be a trend, but he ends up realizing that no one is talking to him and ends up going to Kendra, telling her that he's a pariah, which does lead to this humorous scene of Kendra not knowing what a pariah is and calling it a pepariah. But we do end up seeing him confronting Caleb, with Caleb once again trashing him for being too controlling, and we do end up seeing Caleb complaining to Kelly about Bruce, which leads to Kelly talking about how she's ready to blindside Bruce, something she continuously says through the rest of her game, which is dumb. And again, for me, like, targeting Bruce here is just ridiculous. For her to not take a shot at the Rebas and instead want to take a shot at someone that is undyingly loyal to her just because she's annoyed at how he's acting and how he constantly ends up talking and considers him to be an anchor to her game. But again, I personally feel like he's only an anchor because you're making him an anchor. You're constantly in that mindset looking at him as a hindrance to your game instead of looking at him as a valuable weapon. One that is, again, a number for you, an undyingly loyal number that has an idol in his pocket. And then again, to throw all that away this early in the game is completely ridiculous to me. But I do think a large factor into that, and something that I will give the Reba 4 a lot of credit for, is it does seem like a lot of this comes from this mindset that Kelly doesn't realize how solidified the opposition is against her. Where just in general, it feels very shocking how little the Reba 4 were recognized early on in the merge here, where despite them again being set up on the edit as the most solidified alliance and them really running a lot of the game, they were really able to keep their closeness a secret. Where part of that does seem to stem from the current meta of the show, where I think like someone like Kelly vocalized this in her post-game press that she was just shocked at the fact that there could be this tribal-based alliance that was this strong in the post-merge, in the modern day of Survivor. But even beyond that, again, I do think it is indicative of some pretty impressive play from the Reba 4 and seeing them coming into the merge in a power position and proceed to actively navigate through the game in tandem together while still operating secretly. Again, that is a very difficult task to execute, and it seems like they did it pretty flawlessly. Anyway, at this point, we then cut to the immunity challenge, which obviously ends up being the return of the Mergatory, with it functioning similarly to previous seasons. Though we do finally get a new challenge this time. So that's something. But unsurprisingly, the team that has Bruce on it ends up winning the challenge, which was pretty obvious based on the typical editing tropes there. But obviously, the other targets that were set up earlier in the episode, and Caleb and J Maya, end up being on the losing team. Who would have guessed? But obviously, the winners here get to go to the sanctuary where good things happen, because Jeff is still trying to make that a catchphrase. But again, here we do end up seeing the Reba members talk about how they want J Maya to go, while we end up seeing the Belo members talk about how they want Caleb to go. Again, both sides essentially wanting to take out someone that's supposed to be on their side, which felt ridiculous. Oh, back at camp, we do get D campaigning against Jay, to where J Maya ends up getting more Dodo content with her talking about how Reba has her back when they're literally the only people that are campaigning against her right now. And we do end up getting to see a lot from Jake's perspective here, with us seeing his bond with both J Maya and with Caleb, and wanting neither of them to go, but not really having much agency in this round to do anything about it, which really sums up the majority of his game. But eventually the others return to camp, where we do see the target fully landing on Caleb now, with the Rebas seemingly caving in just due to the fact that they realize that's the easier path, despite the fact that, again, this is better for Reba to begin with, where again, this is bad for Belo, despite them being the ones that are pushing for this. Initially, we do end up seeing them talk about splitting the vote between Jay and Caleb, to which we do get some pretty good content from Austin here, where once again we have him wanting this to be a unanimous vote to cover for his sacrificed vote, which, considering him also having immunity here as well, and the likes of D not even being considered for the vote, it really makes no difference to his game on whether or not they split the vote or not. So I do think he ends up playing this pretty well, though I don't really understand how everyone else agrees to this, so where, again, how did not a single person plan on casting a rogue vote in the case of an idol, especially considering the non-immune players here are very susceptible to be taken out from an idol play. So again, all that felt really ridiculous to me. But like Jake, we do see others like Katura and Emily being against the Caleb vote, though don't really do much to stop it, though also, to be fair, again, there's not much they could have really done here. Though we do end up seeing Emily warning Caleb that the votes are against him, to which we then get talk about him using his shot in the dark. So again, I wonder what's going to happen here. But we do end up seeing some last second scrambling from Caleb, where we do end up seeing him try to get back on Reba's good sides, with him trying to push for them to go for Jay, to which he ends up leaking to them about Bruce's idol, which, I mean, I understand why he does this. Obviously, it's him trying to secure trust with them, but it really ends up kind of sealing his fate for the following round instead. But through this scene, we do get a pretty fun confessional from him here, saying that he can't play the game alone like a vigilante, saying, "I'm not Batman, I'm Caleb, I'm the Canadian," which was a funny way to lead into a pretty intense tribal, where again, it was pretty clear that all the votes were going on to Caleb here, and we do end up seeing Caleb fighting for his life, with him openly calling out J Maya along the way, with him also having, again, another pretty sloppy play of him, and him throwing the Reba women under the bus, talking about how there's a strongest alliance, which is essentially throwing D and Julie under the bus, which certainly doesn't help him in the following round, especially with D being the type of player that blindly targets anyone that mentions her name. But obviously the votes are eventually cast, and we do get some fun from Caleb yelling out Jay's name in a Penner-esque way, while we do obviously see Austin not voting here to get his fully powered idol, all while we do see Sifu struggling with his vote, which actually did convince me that he had switched his vote at the last second. But we do obviously get to Caleb, unsurprisingly, playing his shot in the dark, and what do you know? It comes up as safe. Again, who would have guessed? Though again, despite how obvious this was that it was going to work here, it did still lead to great TV. This being one of those moments where you just rewatch the scene over and over again to see the varying types of reactions that end up occurring here, where most of the cast is jumping up and down in shock of what just occurred, while we then see J Maya obviously knowing that her game is over, and her obviously being in despair, obviously being these very different reactions there. And again, we get to the votes where, again, I was pretty shocked to see that Sifu didn't split his vote onto J Maya, which leads to literally no one splitting their vote somehow, to which we get a 0 vote tribal here, where Caleb now holds the record for most votes nullified in a single tribal. Though I will say, just to clarify about my thoughts on surviving through a shot in the dark play, I mean, to me, that is essentially the most luck dependent way you could possibly survive a vote in Survivor, where it is literally a 1 in 6 chance of you staying in the game. Again, an even more luck dependent version of an idol. So if someone does win the game after a successful shot in the dark play, I would consider that pretty damning to their winning game. But again, it was still nice to see the shot in the dark in this instance actually matter and actually work. There again, I've said this before, that the point of the shot in the dark was more so as a threat to the other players than it actually being this tool that was actually meant to be effective in its own right. Though again, actually seeing it work here though was pretty fun TV. And this does lead to a bit of a live tribal following it, though again, it never really felt like J. Maya had a chance at staying here, where despite her campaigning pretty hard against Emily in this instance, it felt pretty clear that no one was biting, and we do end up getting J. Maya voted out here unanimously. And J. Maya is someone that I do really like. I mean, she is a personality that I found pretty fun in the show. I even listened to her music, where again, I think she's very talented as a singer-songwriter. As a Survivor player, though, she's really bad. And again, it sucks because again, I do feel like there probably is some potential there. And obviously this is all like relative to the modern era of the show where like everyone knows the game pretty well. But again, for her to just be so aloof to the fact that she's on the bottom of the Reba power structure the entire time and making what I consider to be essentially wrong move after wrong move after wrong move on this season was just really frustrating to see. Because again, I wanted her to play well. I wanted her to get out of the position that she was in, where it always felt like she was one of the most expendable people coming into the merge, but it really felt like she never did herself any favors. Though to be fair, a lot of that is just kind of indicative of how poorly positioned she was in the game from the offset, with her just again not finding herself in that core majority group, and her seemingly being distrusted for reasons that again weren't really clear on the show. But despite that, again, I do think she still plays the game pretty suboptimally. Despite the fact that, again, I do really like J. Maya, I just feel like she is not a particularly good Survivor player. And now for episode 7, where we obviously return to camp with Caleb gloating about staying, during which he talks about how he's nullified 12 votes because seemingly no one picked up on the fact that Austin didn't vote, showing that his plan worked out as expected, though really this just seemed to stem from the fact that no one bothered actually counting the votes, as again they should have been able to piece this together. But really the rest of the first half of the episode ends up focusing on how much of a train wreck the Belo tribe is, where we do get more of the Bruce Katurah rivalry, which was a bit strange, where Bruce ends up confronting Katurah in public about her flipping her vote at the last second, which he claims to be part of this plot to get the target on Katurah's back, which, while yeah, she's against him, it's once again just feeling people going after their own numbers, as Bruce and Katurah are numbers that need each other at this point in the game, and through doing so, he ends up pissing off the other Belo members, with us getting more talk about how he's a liability, with both Kendra and Kelly talking about blindsiding Bruce here, which again, happens pretty much every episode, despite the fact that it's so bad for their games. But here we do also see more of the Bruce-Caleb relationship, with Jake trying to get them back together, as obviously they are numbers for him, though this ends up turning out to be a pretty awkward conversation, with Bruce coming off as really patronizing once again. That leads to Caleb saying that it's clear why Bruce has only played 14 hours before, and that he doesn't know how he made it 28 years without Bruce telling him what to do, which was some fun content. But also here we do get some more focus on the Caleb-Katurah relationship, with her talking about wanting to work with him, which obviously by the end of this episode clearly comes off as a bit of ironic content, but also undermining Katurah in the process. Also here we end up getting the final Emily and Caleb scene, with this very much feeling like a farewell to their storyline, where Emily ends up lying to Caleb here that they have the numbers to save him, with her not wanting to stick her neck out for him, and talks about letting him go in favor of working with Drew and Austin, which I mean straight up I don't think there's much she could have done to save Caleb even if she wanted to here, but again letting him go over the likes of Drew and Austin, who clearly have other priorities and other options, does not seem like an optimal move here. Anyway, we then get to the immunity challenge, where Jeff says everyone looks good merged, only to then demerge them as we're doing the split tribal twist. Again, here at the final 12, which I was pretty happy to see, to where obviously I would prefer if they just didn't do it at all, but considering Jeff's fetish over wanting smaller tribes so there's no place to hide, I mean this was obviously going to happen. Like still, I'm happy about the change to having it at 12 here, where again it allows us to have have 6 people votes instead of 5 people, which again is a little bit more interesting. Also allowing us to have an unfettered final 10 and final 9 rounds, which are very important rounds in setting up the end game, especially more so than the final 12 and final 11 rounds that this version skips, though, I mean, in reality, they end up finding a way to ruin that also, which we'll obviously talk about. But again, I overall do approve of the choice to move the twist earlier here, though I would have probably just preferred sending 2 tribes to tribal pre-merge over this, but whatever. But here we do learn that there are other stakes to this challenge, where not only is the winner going to win a reward for their team, but they also guarantee that every member of their team gets to be on the jury, with the person voted out of the losing team's group ends up being the final pre-juror, which is pretty brutal. Where coming into this episode, I was wondering how exactly they were going to handle this, if they were going to start the jury after the 2 vote-offs here or before, but for it to be in the middle is just such a gutting way to lose out on jury here. Again, losing out because of a random draw that gave you a team that didn't have a person that was good enough to beat the best person from the other team. Again, essentially basing this all on the actions of someone other than you, who in essence that person would be guaranteed to make jury no matter if they win or not. Again, just kind of sucks. And I get that for Jeff, this is again increasing the stakes of the challenge by creating this greater disparity between the winners and the losers. But again, I just don't care about that. And again, I just feel bad for the person who gets screwed over in this instance. But either way, the challenge ends up being Get a Grip, which is where the segment about Dee's toes finally comes to roost, I guess, with Dee winning the challenge here, with us constantly getting shots of her toes. And she says her toes won her the challenge, even though she didn't seem to even use her toes. But again, her win here was clearly foreshadowed. And along with that does come some pretty decent personal content for her. They're talking about her family once again, which again, she seems to do a lot on the show. But here we also do see Kelly winning individual immunity as well, which is nice seeing 2 women win the first immunity challenge of the season, obviously being a nice change of pace coming from BB25. But Kelly's group is the first one to end up going to tribal here, which ends up being a group containing a Bello majority with Bruce, Kendra, and Kelly there, though obviously fractured. Also having Drew and Emily together alongside Sifu, who is a clear outlier in this group. And just looking at this group, I did very much feel like Sifu was the pretty easy boot here, though with that I do find it strange just how little content Sifu ended up getting in this episode, with him only getting 1 confessional here, and that one just being a really sad one, where he does talk about him realizing his mortality in the game and talks about how his dream is to make it to jury, and it breaks his heart that he could go tonight, which is again just this tragic content for him on his way out. But we do end up getting a lot of focus around Drew here, with him being nervous in this configuration, with him initially campaigning for a Sifu blindside, which I do think is probably the right call for him as a self-preservation move, even though obviously the optimal move would have been to try to get Bruce out. But really the optimal move for most other people on this tribe though was probably to get Drew out, which again we never actually see come up somehow, which again feels like the repercussions of no one realizing how close the other Rebas are. But again, it's kind of insane they looked at Sifu as a bigger threat in the game than Drew, which largely felt misguided. But it is here where we also learn about Drew not having his safety without power, with him having left it back at camp. Obviously the season was filmed during the airing of Survivor 44. I believe they actually started filming right before the airing of the map boot, to which obviously in that episode we do get that critical lesson of you always having to take your bag everywhere, so where again we see it once again playing a factor on this season, which again I still hate how this is even a thing you have to think of in Survivor, where you could just be screwed over by leaving your advantages back at camp. And it doesn't even make sense to me why production even wants this to happen. Like, I don't understand why they wouldn't just give them their advantages, as it obviously ends up limiting their possibilities coming into the vote, which again just plays into the fundamental issue with the new era. But despite us seeing Drew talking about it here, it does seem to actually screw over Sifu even more than him. Despite it not making the show, I mean, Sifu in his exit press did talk about how he did end up leaving his bag behind as well, meaning that he didn't have his shot in the dark to play, along with not having his fake idol he was wanting to utilize, leaving him really defenseless here, which again just further adds to his tragedy. Though again, instead of his story, we do get a lot more of the focus onto Bruce, who is obviously being brought up as a potential target here, with Kendra really leading the charge and wanting Bruce out, which again is dumb, though thankfully we do see Kelly talking some sense into her and being kind of smart in getting her to stop targeting Bruce, even though again she should be targeting Drew, which she doesn't do either. Again, just insanity to me that Drew's name never even comes up in this situation, where this this would have been a perfect time to take him out with him being isolated from his other allies. And there was definitely a possible 3-2-1 vote they could have executed to get him out here, but again, just never gets brought up. And again, we obviously get this fake setup to Bruce having to play his idol, even though he doesn't, and it's fine. So again, this is just a pretty apparent Sifu vote off with no real suspense to it. While on D's side of things, we do get a bit more of intrigue coming into the vote, though it also ends up being a largely predictable one, where the group here is structured similarly to the other group, but with Reba in the majority instead, with Dee, Julie, and Austin together. Though they obviously have Caleb here as a pretty clear target, a plan that Reba instantly agrees on, with Dee having this vendetta against Caleb for what he said at the previous tribal, with this being one of the times that we obviously see Dee blindly targeting whoever was targeting her, to which she is again effective in getting her target out, which again feels like the show giving props to her as a player. And coming off as a mob boss here, with us seeing Austin seemingly not wanting to go for Caleb, only for Dee to say that he's not in the position of power to do anything about that, and that they're voting Caleb no matter what, being this villainous tinge for her edit, though again not one completely damning to her winning chances to me. I feel like it was more so them trying to show off Dee as being kind of a badass, more so than her being this unlikable figure. Though what wasn't great for her edit is that starting with this episode, we do start to get a lot of talk about how big of a jury threat Dee is in the game, something that gets reiterated over and over again in following episodes, which again, it's pretty rare of a winner to get very clear talk about how they're going to win the game if they get to the end being portrayed on the show, where again, obviously they like to typically save that suspense for the winner reveal. So the fact that it was made so blatant here about Dee did definitely knock some points for Dee from me, along with the fact that we do also see her being mostly wrong about Jake, saying that he's going to be easy to persuade, only for us to cut to Jake, who has decided that now is the time to make a move, and that he wants to save Caleb and instead target Julie for some reason over Austin. Again, just clearly showing you how much they don't see the Reba before, where again, I guess this was a thing to weaken Dee, where the plan was to cause a tie and hope that Austin flips on the revote, which straight just feels like a really half-baked plan here, to where, and there's just simply too much risk here of potentially actually going to rocks, which is simply not worth it in this situation where the groups are obviously going to come back together and the dynamics are so much in flux at this point. But it is when Jake outlines his plan that we actually get a flash forward to Tribal, which was surreal to see on Survivor. Obviously seeing them attempt to do something akin to the Genius, and just like in the Genius, I actually don't like the usage of fast forwards, as obviously typically it just spoils what's potentially going to happen. Most of the times even just being a clear misdirect, where by you realizing it's a misdirect you can kind of piece together what actually happened. But again, this is all done in a very strange way, where we're seeing footage of the actual tribal from later that night, all while Jake is talking through the plan, making it very clear that this plan isn't going to go through, as why else would they be showing this right now? Like, why would they spoil that this big blindside is going to occur? That makes no sense, but either way. But obviously, to make this plan go through, we do need Katurah in on the plan, where we do see Caleb talking about how, due to him having told the Rebas about Bruce's idol in the previous round, he's obviously worried about this info getting back to Katurah and burning his relationship with Katurah, to where he now wants to tell Katurah about the idol, something that Jake tells him not to, but we see Caleb do it anyway, to which the edit portrays it as Caleb revealing this information really sunk him, though I think in reality, most of the worst of it really comes from Jake, who later tells her that the entire ring story was this plot the entire tribe outside of her was in on, which clearly shows Katurah that she's on the bottom of Belo, that makes her less incentivized to go through with this plan. And again, despite the fact that Jake ends up ultimately failing at what he's trying to do here, and I personally feel like he's the most at fault for isolating Katurah, his content on this episode actually ends up being pretty strong, where I do feel like they largely shielded him from a lot of negativity they could have potentially gotten, though to be fair, that doesn't last for that much longer. But with that also leads it to, again, some negative content for Katurah, where she talks about how Caleb is good for her game and that she trusts him, and talks about getting rid of him would be an emotional move, only for her to go through with that anyway, which is obviously a bad look. Even though, again, I think strategically, I actually feel like this is actually the right call. Again, I don't think it's worth going the rocks in this situation. And straight up, I disagreed with this call at the time, though I think I was wrong. And I think that's largely from the fact that I was expecting there to be more blowback on Katurah for making this move, though we find out that really just no one's upset at her, and really more people are upset at Jake for even trying to flip the vote than Katurah not going through with the vote. So I think Katurah probably made the right call here. But with that, obviously Katurah ends up voting with the Rebas, and Caleb is finally taken out of the game in a 4-2 vote, where the Rebas themselves are surprised at the second Julie vote that comes up, where they had clearly thought it was going to be unanimous coming into it, where again, straight up, this 100% feels like just kind of a plot that came out at the last second. It really just feels like Jake made this spontaneous move that no one was truly on board for, which seems to just ruin all of his social capital coming into the following round. But with that, again, let's talk about the boots from this episode, starting it off with Sifu, who I feel kind of sad for Sifu when looking at his run on this season, where Sifu is someone that should have been this massive character. I mean, Sifu is a larger-than-life personality. I mean, he clearly came into the season feeling like someone that could be the next coming of a coach, yet instead, he's simply under-edited on this season. He does have some wacky moments here and there, but he just simply is the least prominent of the people that made it this far. I mean, even in his boot episode here, he only gets one confessional, to where we very rarely get to see where Sifu is in the game. And to be fair, I mean, Sifu seemed to be on the outs, to where maybe there wasn't much to his game. But I do feel like it's a shame that we never got to see more of him, because he seemed like a fun personality, though at the same time, again, I don't get the sense that he's that great of a player. Then let's talk about Caleb, who was obviously the star of the season for the first half of it. Again, I think alongside Emily were the two biggest characters. Yeah, despite that, again, like I never had much faith in Caleb to win the season. Again, his edit didn't really feel like one that had much weight to it as a winner, with him having a pretty terrible premiere. And even then, just everyone seemed to talk about how they didn't really trust him. And overall, I do think Caleb is a bit of a tough player to assess, where he is one that obviously had a massive target on his back, and you can argue, okay, that means he's bad at threat management, but really, I don't feel like he does that much actively wrong threat management wise. I think it's simply just the fact that he's Caleb that makes him a massive threat, which I guess you would want him to like tone down his personality, but again, considering the position he was in, where he constantly had to fight from the bottom and tried to build relationships wherein he simply had none, I don't really fault him that much for his threat management on this season. And really, I do think Caleb is an impressive player. And the fact that he's able to build the bond with Emily early on, that's eventually able to save him, is pretty impressive play there. Though at the same time, again, obviously, pretty much everything that happens from the merge on is pretty bad. But still, I mean, obviously, Caleb was a massive star in this season. Clearly a fan favorite, and someone that I would expect to see again if we get a returning season anytime soon. But with that, we get to episode 8, where we obviously started off with the reaction to the Caleb vote, with Jake seemingly admitting to the fact that his plan was a reckless one. And we do strangely end up seeing Bruce, of all people, being really annoyed at him and calling him a liability, again, coming from Bruce. But here we also see Jake apologizing to Julie, which doesn't seem to gain him any favors there, with this kind of being the start of him being the social pariah in the game and him continuing to skate on by with very little agency in how he ends up navigating the game. But beyond that, we also get a scene the following morning involving all the women being alone in the shelter, which has the women talking about creating an all-women's alliance. That instantly gets ratted out by Emily, and in general, this never really felt like a thing that was actually a practicality, with it just coming off as this kind of random scene here just to kind of introduce the concept of the women targeting Bruce, again, once again, putting a target on Bruce's back because there always is one. With again, Kelly now talking about how now is the time to take him out for some reason. Again, just feeling like a move that'll sink her game. But at this point, there is a boat that arrives at the camp out of the blue, where we see some Fijians come out of the boat and placing a table with some bowls in front of them. No explanation, which was a bit strange, but eventually they end up reading the note, which reveals that this is the return of the Survivor auction, which obviously people have been wanting for years, me included, with, again, me finding the Survivor auction to always be this fun segment on the show that really allowed for some great character moments. And straight up, while it was cool to hear that it was coming back here, I always feel like people got a bit too hyped for it, seeming to look at this as if it was a sign that Survivor was going back in the right direction, when it's like, no, this is simply doing the same thing they've been doing throughout the entire new era of adding in this gimmick to the post-merge episodes that's able to waste enough time so they can guarantee they have enough content to fill up an episode, considering the fact that each round is comprised of only 1 or 2 days. But again, I did like seeing the auction back here, though obviously they had to make a billion changes to it, as with anything they do in a new era, where the auction all starts off with a dash into the jungle to find money, meaning that everyone's going to start with a different money count, which was fine. I mean, I don't mind this change to the auction. Would I have preferred the OG? Obviously, but this was an egregious change. Though I do think just seeing people running into the jungle searching for things is just not that interesting a TV, though it ends up working out here, particularly due to the fact that Bruce ends up taking his time and just walking through the jungle, saying that he's going to use his senior intuition to find some, to which he ends up spending most of this segment not finding anything, and we get this funny shot of Bruce complaining about not finding anything while Julie right behind him ends up finding one that he just walked by. And we obviously have to cut to Katurah, that Bruce doesn't have any money, but here we do get the reveal that each of the tubes do have different money amounts, which is a level of randomness added in here for something like the auction and not something more detrimental to your game. I actually don't mind it here, and I do think it adds a bit of a quality to what could have been something that very much favored more physical people, through them obviously having more ability to find these more money. But then we get to the auction itself, where we start off with a montage of previous seasons to explain what it is, which was a nice little callback there. But here we finally learn what the other changes made to the auction are. First up, the reveal that there are no advantages here, which was to be expected, as obviously that was a major reason why they stopped doing them to begin with. And then we see another change that I didn't mind, in the fact that the auction's length will be determined on the spot, with only 5 items being guaranteed, while Jeff will do a random draw to determine how many more items after that they go for, which again, I think is a change for the positive and making the auction more raw, where they actually have to show every item on the show, making it feel like we got the full story of the auction. But then we get to the big negative change here, where in new era tradition of having to make everything dangerously fun, the player with the most money at the end of the auction will end up losing their votes, because we obviously didn't have enough of that on the show already. Which, I mean, to me, this felt like a massive overcorrection from the issues with the original auction, where there people would obviously hold out on their money in order to buy an advantage. While here, this is essentially incentivizing people to waste their money in order to avoid a disadvantage, which leads to people quickly figuring out the optimal strat here of just blowing all your money on the first item that interests you. And what makes it even more lame is the fact that it just guarantees that whoever has the most money coming into each round will more than likely just win that item and spend all their money in doing so to avoid being the person that loses their vote, which again took a lot of the fun away from the auction. Though obviously it does lead to some drama of who will end up losing their vote, to where despite Bruce coming into it the least amount of money, and you would assume would be someone that should be safe from losing their vote, the auction actually turns out in a way to where he ends up being one of the only people with money by the end, to where he is the one that loses his vote, which ironically I actually think would have been a positive for his game, as it would have put him in this position where had he not won immunity, he actually would have been pretty incentivized to use his idol in a position where, again, the entire tribe was pretty much coming for him, where obviously losing his vote here would leave him defenseless, so this would actually probably make it less likely that he went out with an idol in his pocket. But as for the actual events of the auction, we do end up seeing Kendra seemingly gaming the auction first by going all in on the first item, that being pretzels and beer, which was kind of an underwhelming item. But she does proceed to get personal content about this, where they're talking about how it reminds her of her dad, and talks about how she hadn't met him until she was an adult, which very much felt like the type of personal content that someone would get in the episode before they are eliminated, which ends up being a common trend in a new era. So because that, I very much pegged Kendra as the person to be booted in the following round, and what do you know, I was right. But beyond that, we do also get some fun moments through this auction. I mean, we get Bruce just yelling 80 for items, only for people to quickly outbid him. We see Emily dancing around when she ends up eating, with Jeff being shocked, saying, "Who are you?" We see Dee spending $900 on a milkshake, which was really ridiculous, so obviously playing into the optimal strat. We end up seeing Katurah ending up winning giant fish franchise, which she obviously turns away, only for Austin to then spend $100 on them himself, to which he then proceeds to take a massive bite out of them, which was disgusting to see. But we also see Drew getting candy and him kind of being annoyed at it and attempting to negotiate with Jeff the swap, only for him to be turned down. But eventually we do get to the point where Jeff tries to fake them all out, with him pretending like every item is the final item of the auction, with us getting a lot of focus on Kelly in particular, with her being worried about losing her votes, only for her to barely get through it, with her ending up being the final person to be able to spend all of their money. But really, just overall, again, this is just kind of a fine auction, not one of the best in the franchise's history, though I did find it refreshing to see back after obviously all the years that was gone. Though straight up, in terms of like big moments, I do feel like this is probably one of the least notable auctions of the bunch, especially when you take away the appeal of seeing all these new format changes to it. But beyond that, right before the immunity challenge, we do obviously have the focus more on another plot to take out Bruce, with Drew talking about how he wants to flush his idol, and we do get to see Katurah starting to work with the Rebas, with them letting her pick their target, aka they knew she would pick Bruce, to which, who would have guessed it? She picks Bruce. But then we get to the immunity challenge, where we see the return of the Rice negotiation, which obviously everyone was eagerly anticipating. But to be fair, I do feel like they actually made it pretty fun here. Adding this interesting twist here of Jeff literally pulling out a knife and cutting the bag open, which obviously increased the stakes here and having to make a decision right away. And I did find it funny the way he does it too, where he ends up making Katurah think that he's going to add something to the deal, only for him to then do the complete opposite. The challenge itself here ends up being one we've seen before, them having to hold up a log, using a rope, to where we do get a pretty close battle between Bruce and Julie, which was actually really impressive to see Julie hold out for this long in a challenge like this. But Bruce obviously ends up winning here, as expected considering the earlier edit of the episode, leading to a really fun edit of Kendra talking about how annoyed she is at Bruce winning, only for us to then cut to Bruce gloating with his necklace in the confessional. But at this point, we do end up seeing that Jake is the primary target due to Bruce winning immunity, which the Bellas themselves end up going along with for some reason. Again, it feeling just ridiculous at this point how disorganized Bello is, to where had they just worked together and used Bruce's idol effectively, they could have gotten control back in the game. But no, instead they decide to take out Jake while still being aloof to how close the Rebas are, all while Kelly is constantly complaining about how she could possibly get votes here due to her attachment of Bruce, which is like, no, I mean, if you're getting votes here, it's because you're clearly the central figure in the Bello tribe, you're clearly the best player on that tribe, and also you took the amulet, which puts a bigger bullseye on your back, to where straight up for the Rebas, Kelly is the perfect target for them here. And what do you know, we then cut to Drew, who correctly points this out, where obviously he realizes that Jake isn't someone that is that beneficial to get rid of at this point, and considering the risk of Bruce playing the idol on him, or Jake himself finding an idol and playing it on himself, it is a much better move to put the safe vote onto Kelly and blindsiding her out of the game. Though this is a spot where the women clearly don't want to go through with this, an aspect of this vote that wasn't really as focused on, though I think the fact that it wasn't definitely feels like them trying to hide some undermining for D there. While at the same time, I do feel like the portrayal of all this ends up being pretty bad for Austin, where despite the fact that this is a vote that culminates his revenge storyline and gains him the amulet, we see almost none of him in the lead up to the vote itself, where instead Drew gets all the content and all the credit for the vote off, which is obviously even more damning for Austin here, though I mean, to be fair, he wasn't winning at this point anyway. But we do get a pretty great tribal here, with Jake clearly thinking that he's on his way out and trying to shake things up at the last second, with him struggling to answer a question and claiming that he's gassed out when Jeff asks him one, which straight up, I'm a bit unsure on if this was entirely an act, though clearly what he does later is an act, where he does end up saying, if I pull out my idol, and then corrects himself following that, as if that was a slip of the tongue there, obviously to try to make the others think he has an idol, which again, at the end of the day, didn't really matter, but again, it was at least fun to see someone try that. But again, here we do see Jake playing a shot in the dark, only for it to be not safe, but none of that matters anyway, as we obviously get the votes coming up, where we do see 3 votes for Jake, only to then see the onslaught of Kelly votes, which leads to this all-time great blindside reaction here from Kelly, where she ends up being extremely devastated as each of her votes comes up, and we see these little moments from her asking Austin if he did it and him him shaking his head, to her saying, "What the hell, guys?" and saying she should have trusted her gut as she hugs everybody. She also forgets her torch, which felt very reminiscent of the Sophie blindside in Winners at War. Oh, well, we get great reactions from Kendra as well, with her being really shocked and proceeds to get emotional, along the fact that we also get a great reaction from Jake, who yells out "whoa" as the final vote comes up and proceeds to apologize for it right afterwards. And we also see him being shocked at people playing smart. Again, all this just being a really fantastic blindside, being a masterstroke from the Rebas here and getting rid of a central Bello figure while also getting the Bellos themselves to turn on each other, obviously making it less likely they end up getting back together in the following round. But with that, we obviously lose Kelly, who I think was probably the best player on the Bello tribe. I mean, she seemed to be the player that was able to position herself in the middle and have all these really great one-on-one bonds. Again, her blindside here ends up being one that gets talked about, it being one of the most devastating ones of the season. Like, I do think Kelly definitely had a major impact on this season, despite the fact that I personally found Kelly kind of boring. I don't feel like she really brought much entertainment to the show, while mixing that in with the fact that I also found her gameplay a bit frustrating, particularly in the post-merge, with her constantly trying to let go of Bruce and blaming Bruce for all of her issues, when really I feel like a lot of that more so stems from her overtness and how well positioned she is within the Bello group, alongside the fact that, again, she took the amulet, which just puts a target on her back. Again, I just personally feel like a lot of these things that she was blaming Bruce for were things that were actually her fault to begin with. But again, I do think she ends up having a pretty great downfall on the season. I think her exit from the game is a really notable one, and I do think she is a pretty good player, just one that, again, did not make for the most riveting TV. But then we get to episode 9, which probably ends up being one of the worst episodes of the season, with this feeling like the show reverting back to typical tropes of the overcomplicated twists that strip away agency that really plague the new era, while also mixing that in with the dumb mega challenge that we've seen the previous 2 seasons, which was obviously done to make an episode out of just a singular day, and mixing that in with a predictable result. It really ends up making this a really underwhelming episode. We do start off the episode with us spending a lot of time seeing the reaction to the Kelly vote off, with us seeing the duality of Kendra being devastated, crying on the beach, while Jake is celebrating him still being in the game. Getting content here that felt very reminiscent to Owens in 43, in how he's clearly being portrayed here as having no real agency in the game, where despite the fact that he is getting this blatant underdog content, it does feel in a way that people just don't really respect him in the game, to where I really had him pegged as a losing finalist by this point in the season. But eventually we do end up seeing Bruce confronting Reba about why they took out Kelly, which leads to them revealing to him how much she was annoyed by him, telling him that she thought he was overbearing, to which we do see Bruce being genuinely hurt by this. Again, him learning that the person that he put all of his trust into didn't really even like him. And we see this leading to him reflecting back to how he treats his family, his daughter in particular, where he says he treated his daughter the same way he treated Kelly, and now he needs to go back and ask his daughter if he needs to make changes, which that ends up being followed up by him talking about growing up in the foster care system, which again was all this really great content for Bruce, but obviously just feels very much like the content that Kendra got in the previous episode, which again did make it seem like Bruce was probably on his way out in the following episode, despite how illogical it felt like it would have been considering the fact that he had an idol. But again, at first this did seem like a scene of nothing but positivity for Bruce, something you rarely see for Bruce, until we then literally cut to Drew talking about how Bruce has been playing an imaginary game of Survivor, and now that his game has come crumbling down, he has 2 choices of facing reality or rejecting it, which really just shows you how little respect they have for Bruce out there, where this might be one of the most biting confessionals I've ever heard about someone trashing someone else's game. But meanwhile, we do end up seeing Katurah and Kendra talk, to where Kendra does seemingly get on the right page finally, and talking about how Dee is the biggest threat in the game. Again, being a bit too blatant of setup of Dee winning if she had gotten to the end, but we then cut from this to us just seeing Katurah rat Kendra out. Back to the Rebas, which, I mean, it was nice to see her playing both sides, but again, I really don't love how she just continues to empower the Rebas in this position where they're in a spot where they could just outright run the game following this round, with Austin now having 2 idols due to him obviously having voted out Kelly, making his amulet another idol, and this obviously ends up up leading to Dee being Dee and wanting Kendra out because that's what she does. And along with that, we also get another plan to flush Bruce's idol because obviously. But also here we do end up getting a lot of focus surrounding Emily as well, with her talking to Drew and Austin, and ends up testing them by bringing up the concept of targeting Dee, with her recognizing how close Dee and Austin are, to where we do end up hearing from Austin where he says that he understands where she's coming from, but he is clearly just unwilling to take a shot at Dee. We're mixing this in with some content we later see from Julie as well. It really feels like Dee just had some sort of mist over the people in this Reba alliance, where it is kind of insane that she had some of these people being undyingly loyal to her. But obviously this leads to Emily being apprehensive about moving forward with them, to where this content ends up bringing me mostly mixed signals, where it very much could have been looked at as something to prop Emily up, as something that was going to make her likely to win, with her being aware of her position. But I could also see it being set up for her downfall down the road, of her being unable to split up the Rebas, which at this point I was really unsure of which one it was, to where again Emily ends up being a pretty major frontrunner for the majority of the Edgic community for most of the season, though for me something always felt kind of off about it, to where while a lot of her edit is something that is a bit unavoidable just simply due to her general storyline and how integral she was to the early portions of the season, it still felt very different from the type of edit you would expect of her archetype, which left me a bit unsure where exactly her edit was going. But eventually we do end up seeing the players get tree mail, with it telling the players to divide themselves into groups of 3, clearly being the return of the mega challenge that we've seen in the previous seasons that had them do a similar thing, which again, I at least do like the fact that they actually gave the players agency in deciding their own teams, which is something they rarely do, though obviously that's something they did in 44 as well. Though here we do see them try to balance out the teams for physical strength, though we do get good content from Drew talking about wanting to keep himself in the numbers advantage within his team, which ironically actually probably ends up not being the optimal strat, as if you lose the challenge it would actually cause your alliance to lose more of your own votes. Obviously they didn't know that. And again, interestingly, they seem to be thinking that they were going to be voting off people in these groups, which again, I don't know how they thought that was going to be the case, that they were actually going to have a 3-person trial, which I mean, I guess to be fair, who knows, considering just love of small tribes, but still that would have been bizarre. But through this we do end up seeing Austin give Julie one of his idols, with her being the only one not in the majority within her group, which again does show you how invested Austin is in this Reba group here, where he's willing to give out one of his idols in this position. But obviously this move to give Julie the idol here ends up being a really detrimental one for Austin's game, one that, like, I think you very much argue really costs Austin the game, as through what we later see, it does obviously lead to Julie staying in the game and him seemingly lose a lot of credibility by the end of the game. And this was obviously a really bad move for him. It's one that I do understand though, especially if, again, he's looking at the game as this very alliance focused one at this point in the game, of him not wanting to risk losing one the Reba 4 when they're not in the majority yet. But still, I mean, like, this ends up being a pretty game-ending move for him. But with that, we then finally get to the Mega Challenge, which they've made even more convoluted than last time, where it is still a 3-round challenge, though they end up adding other stipulations to these rounds, the most egregious of which being the first round, where the losing team of 3 ends up losing all their votes at the final 9. Again, the reason why people were excited that the Split Tribal was moved earlier in the season, they literally just end up ruining that round of gameplay. Again, what was supposed to be one of the most important rounds of the game is now one convoluted by people losing their votes. But we also learn here that those that lose their votes will also go on a journey where they'll have the opportunity to win their votes back, which at least is something that gives them a chance of having their votes back, fixing the screw up of them getting rid of their votes to begin with. But the cons to this are massive, where while it is an interesting concept to have a vote where you don't really even know how many votes there are, it still ends up bringing in this added level of uncertainty to the game, in a spot where if you don't know what's going on, then you're more than likely just going to default doing the obvious move instead of going out of your way to make a bigger move, which again seems opposed to what production even wants. Again, this straight up just ends up stagnating the game while also giving the players less agency. Again, just feeling like a terrible twist all around. round. But outside of that, the challenge does end up playing out similarly to previous seasons, where the winning team of round 2 ends up competing in an endurance challenge between each other for immunity, which I never loved these style challenges of you doing a team challenge that leads up to an individual one. As, and for example, if Bruce's team didn't want him to win, they could have just obviously easily just thrown it and made sure that Bruce was vulnerable at the next tribal. Though to be fair, I do think they added enough incentives to cause people to not want to throw here, particularly the fact that, again, you could potentially lose your vote. Also adding in a reward as well. Again, at least they attempted to make this a little bit more balanced, but at the same time, they could have just like not done it at all. This obviously ends up wasting a lot of time on the show with, again, this entire episode taking place over just one day. And here we end up seeing Jake, Drew, and Dee make a massive comeback in round 1 to where Emily, Katurah, and Austin end up losing their votes, which was a bit lame in that 2 of the swings and Emily and Katurah end up losing their votes, which lessened the possibilities of what was going to happen in the following round, with Emily in particular obviously being a player that could have potentially made a big move here. But we do end up seeing Bruce, Kendra, and Julie winning round 2 to where who would have guessed? Bruce wins immunity again. Again, how shocking after him getting literally the exact same style of content last episode right before the challenge. But it's at this point where we do have the groups being separated, which again just feels like this artificial way of creating enough content to fill out the show, where we do see Drew, Jake, and Dee back at camp, obviously having neither won or lost the challenge as a whole, where we do see them not even being able to truly strategize for the round, as they simply just don't know who is and isn't going to get the vote. And along with the fact that they can't even talk to the other players either, it really leads to nothing game-wise happening here outside of Dee just continuing to want to target Kendra for coming for her. Though we do get this fun little moment here that ends up being another pretty villainous scene for the Rebas, with Drew and Dee making rice while Jake walks off and ends up eating most of it, only leaving Jake the scraps, which again is a villainous scene for sure, though I do think they could have definitely portrayed this in a more overtly negative way, to where I do feel like the tone of this scene mostly felt jovial, where you're supposed to be thinking this is a fun character moment outside of it being these 2 people doing something mean-spirited. But either way, we also see Bruce, Kendra, and Julie go to the sanctuary where they get a rotisserie chicken to share amongst the 3, which again, the fact that they only got 1 for 3 people felt like a bit of a ripoff. But here we do end up getting content from Julie with her seemingly working both sides, with her pretending to bellow that she's willing to flip against Dee, only for us to get a confessional from her saying that she actually wants to go to the end with Dee. Again, despite it being set up that Dee would easily beat her in the end, which felt like pretty damning content for Julie here, along the fact that she comes out of this getting Kendra and Bruce to agree to go for Jake, and her talking about really wanting him out, only for her to then back down on that notion by the time of the vote itself. Or alongside that, we also get to see Kendra again seemingly having the right state of mind and wanting to get Bello back together, though we do see Bruce seemingly giving up on that concept and just accepting the fact that Jake will go home. So I think mixing that in the fact that there's obviously the uncertainty of the vote itself, it does lead to her kind of being resigned over voting out Jake, which obviously ends up being a more suboptimal move there. But then we end up cutting to the journey, where you end up seeing Emily, Katurah, and Austin being given a math puzzle to solve in order to get their votes back, which I will say did seem relatively easy. I do personally feel like I would have figured this out pretty quickly, though we do end up seeing both Emily and Katurah struggle here, with Emily getting a lot of sympathetic content, with her relating this back to her job and to her experiences back on Lulu, though they both end up losing their votes here, while Austin gets it right, essentially being the worst case scenario for the round, again taking away the 2 swing votes that could have potentially caused the flip to happen, all while Austin gets his vote back, meaning that the Rebas just outright have the majority anyway, and are also the only ones to even know that they have the majority, as Austin proceeds to lie to everyone else about not having his vote, which to be fair is a pretty interesting concept of us getting to the point now where we're having players pretend to not have their vote when in reality they do. But really all of this just makes it even more obvious that Kendra is on her way out. So again, we do get some trouble from Julie not agreeing to the plan, but Dee continues to push for it, where we do get some genuinely bad content for Dee with her own alliances, calling her paranoid, and her coming off as pretty forceful through this, though again, she does get her way by the end of it. And again, I personally felt that there was no real suspense towards the back half of the episode, where despite the fact that we do see Emily campaigning to try to save Kendra, and Drew talking about considering it never felt like an actual thing. Drew get the tribal, where also, again, not much of intrigue really happens there either. Outside of Drew bringing up the Sword of Damocles, which obviously Jeff just froths over that metaphor. And that's getting a funny moment from Austin when he votes, doing so extremely quickly to try to pretend like he doesn't have a vote, which was humorous to see. Though again, getting to the vote ends up being unanimous against Kendra, which in itself is a little bit shocking. The fact that Bruce ends up voting Kendra out, which doesn't even get explained in the episode. Or last we heard he was voting for Jake, and we do get this awkward moment as Kendra ends up seeing her names come out, to where Jake ends up turning to her, seemingly like taunting her on her way out, which is just strange train management. But with that, we do end up losing Kendra, who was a pretty great character on this season. I mean, she was definitely a fun personality. She had great reactions to things. She had wacky, kooky things to say. Again, she kind of ended up being exactly as I expected her to be. Like, as a player, she's fine. Again, she did seem to have some strengths, definitely more so than I saw in the preseason, where I did think she was going to be an early boot. But really, again, I just feel like she was completely outplayed by the Rebas for most of this season, but still seemed to have some pretty good relationships while out there, and isn't the worst player in the world. Also, again, just being a pretty fun character all around. But now for episode 10, which ends up being another slower episode, with very little doubt that Bruce was not going home here, and even if he did survive, the other result that was being set up was a basic Jake vote off, which was also underwhelming, but at least it wasn't riddled with dumb twists. At least that's something. Which again, I love how we're at the point in Survivor where I actually have to point that out. But episode does start with some focus on Jake that again felt very Owen-y, of talking about how he's been playing like a dead dog, but now he's back in the game, only for Drew to then literally call him Charlie Brown, which this parallel was obviously one that we heard about Owen as well. That again made me 100% sure that Jake was going to be a losing finalist at this point. But we do get a bit of a shakeup in editing style for this episode with Bruce, where again in recent episodes he had been set up as this target right before the immunity challenge, but instead here's content shown at the very beginning of the episode, with Jake getting more focused than him later on in the episode, which felt like a clear indicator that this was going to be the time that Bruce is at least not going to win immunity. And by adding in the fact that he got that personal content in the previous episode, to make it feel like it was very likely he was going to get voted out, despite it feeling very unlikely considering the fact that he has this idol that you would expect him to play. But we do then get our daily dose of Bruce and Katurah content that at this point also felt like it was nearing its conclusion, where we shockingly see them talk about working together, only for Bruce to now reveal that he actually doesn't have his idol anymore, as he gave it to Kelly when she was voted out under the fear of the knowledge's power. Funnily, a play that Kelly herself was talking about wanting to do whenever she eventually got Bruce out. But as it turns out, this was obviously a lie, with him testing this plan on Katurah, and that he's going to try to use this lie on others, really seeming like a misguided plan here, in that why would you just now tell everyone a full round after Kelly got voted out that you don't have your idol anymore? I mean, obviously you're doing so because you're trying to get the votes on yourself, but even beyond that, why tell Katurah, where again he knows that Katurah doesn't like him, at least at one point in the season, where for him to seemingly be putting his trust into her was already dumb, as obviously Katurah, being Katurah, ends up ratting this plan back out later in the episode. And we do proceed to see Katurah talk about how ridiculous this plan is and calls it half-brained, with only for us to then cut to Bruce utilizing this plan on Jake, to where it actually seems to work, being a pretty bad look for Jake once again, to where Bruce talks about how Jake can't keep his mouth shut and will rat him out to the Rebas, which, to be fair, we actually see Bruce being proven right for once here. So that's something. But here we do see Bruce and Jake talk about taking out Dee, but seemingly realize that there isn't a way to do it, and instead settle on targeting Julie, who they really hype up as a big threat in this episode, which felt jarring. But this plan doesn't last, as again, Jake does decide to drop Bruce here and does tell Drew about Bruce not having an idol, something that we see Drew also believe, which isn't a particularly good look for him, but this does lead to Drew saying that Bruce and Jake are drawing dead, which felt pretty apparent based on the edit. Obviously, this all ends up setting up the Drew and Jake relationship that humorously crumbles by the end of the episode. But also here we get a lot of content surrounding Julie, who ends up being really emotional throughout this episode, struggling with her having to betray people that trusted her, flashing back to Kelly and Kendra, who, while we did see her talk game with Kendra in particular, we really didn't see her role in her betraying them, especially considering how she didn't really want either of them to go. So again, this did feel like a bit of strange content there. But we do see her getting emotional with Drew, to which we do end up seeing Drew get emotional as well, something that was pretty shocking to see from him. But this has them seemingly struggle with the concept of the Reba 4 having to turn against each other eventually, which I do find kind of humorous how people keep on talking about this season about how the Reba 4 are these like villains that lack any depth as a group, when again we're constantly being shown their perspective and get these moments like this that are trying to humanize them, demonstrating how close the group has gotten. Beyond that, we do get a boring obstacle course reward challenge that does culminate in a table maze, with a surprising result here in Emily winning the challenge, to which we get this massive reaction from her, and really everyone seemed to be really happy for her, and we get this OTT music playing as she wins, and this ends up starting what ends up being a pretty massive episode for Emily. But the reward here ends up being an overnight trip to the sanctuary, along with letters from home, which the content stemming from that was pretty boring. But it does lead to Emily picking all of the women to go alongside her, leading to one of the most surreal segments in the history of the show, where obviously all of the men are back at camp, leading to boys' nights, where out of the blue we get this cheesy 80s rock music playing, which I believe was a song used in Top Gun, to where we get this montage of the men doing men things like burping and farting, I guess. We get Drew flexing to the camera, we have them fist bumping and going fishing together and talking about how overrated bacon is, because again, that's a manly thing to do. I can't believe this is actually a segment I saw on my TV screen. I mean, I still feel like this is one of the strangest scenes in the history of the show. I mean, I love how like I was complaining when Survivor UK was using pop music during its season, and I love how we transitioned to Survivor US, where now we're using mainstream music in an even more ridiculous way. Though, again, this was a fun segment. For all my subsequent rewatches of this scene, I do find a lot more humor from it, though I was really aghast at it the first time I saw it. But at the sanctuary, we again get a lot of hyping up of Emily, with Julie saying that this moment of her winning the challenge, one of the greatest moments of the season. We have Katurah saying that she underestimates herself, and along with the letters from home, where Emily gets this really massive personal segment there, talking about her love for her boyfriend and wanting to get married, along with the fact that she also gets some great strategic content later in the episode. Again, this was a pretty massive episode for Emily, where obviously keeps her status as one of the top contenders, but it also brought a lot of red flags to me. Again, the personal content in particular here, again, is something that, again, Kendra and Bruce both had similar personal segments in the episodes before they were eliminated, to where the fact that she got that scene in this episode made it feel like a practicality that this trend would continue for Emily, despite the rest of her content in this episode being, again, pretty strong. But the segment also ends up including some decent content for Katurah, where she ends up getting a letter from her mom, who she had cut contact with, and we have her getting some of the credit for Bruce's elimination, her ratting him out in this instance, talking about it's time for her revenge move, along the fact that we also get this content later at the immunity challenge that felt like a bit of a resurgence for Katurah's edit, though really just feeling like it was a little too late, and it felt like it was more so a setup to her being a potential decoy winner down the road over a person that would actually go on to win the game. But this episode does make it pretty clear that we're set up for a female winner at this point, with Emily openly declaring that, and considering how most of the top contenders were women, I felt like that even solidified that notion even more. But the women end up returning to camp, which is where we do get this Emily mastermind edit, with us seeing her question where she stands with Drew and Austin, and talks about forging new relationships, with her seemingly building up bonds with the likes of Katurah and Bruce. All for that to just be setting up her wanting to target Bruce due to the Bellows not knowing how to work together, and Bruce being unwilling to flip the power dynamic with his idol, which again, the show props this up as a good move, when in reality, I feel like this is terrible for her to be targeting Bruce here. By taking out Bruce, she's giving the Rebas an outright majority to where they don't need her anymore. She's also getting rid of a target in front of her, while also getting rid of an idol that she could have at least attempted to use for her cause, and also getting rid of someone that, as we see later, seemingly trusts her and is genuine about wanting to work with her. Where to me, again, like her targeting of Bruce here is really bad for her, but from a perspective, again, it is portrayed as the right move, though I do also question why they're giving her this content for Bruce, where, well, yeah, they obviously set up a rivalry with them at the very beginning of the season. I still feel like for this standout episode for Emily here, for it to all culminate in her taking out Bruce, who everyone wanted out the entire time and no one seemed to like, over a more genuine threat in the game, did feel a bit strange to me. But here we do get to see a reveal to Drew about Bruce's ploy that really just solidifies that the vote is going to be split between Bruce and Jake, with everyone assuming that Bruce is going to play his idol, leading to, again, Jake being set up as the boot coming into the immunity challenge, making him feel like a decoy in that sense. But here we do end up seeing Emily talk about doing jury management with Jake, and ends up being genuine with him, and how Drew is targeting him, another move that again seemed to be misguided from Emily, as this could have easily just blown up her spot in the game. But I do, again, find this a bit strange edit-wise as well, and the fact that why is she doing jury management on Jake when, again, it feels very obvious that Jake is more than likely going to make it to the end anyway. So I feel like the fact that that was the justification for this scene was a bit strange, but this does lead to a really awkward fight between Jake and Drew, which ends up being a terrible look for the both of them, with Drew coming off as really indignant, with Jake saying, "You're not a gift from God," while Drew calls Jake a mobster and says, "Get out of here, you're a goon," which again just further cements Jake's Owen-like trajectory, but also again, not a good look for Drew, with him coming off as the James of the situation, with again this feeling very reminiscent to the Owen and James fight. Either way, we do get to the immunity challenge, which ends up being a new endurance challenge that looked really awkward, of them having to hold themselves up on a slope with handles to the side, which is where we do get some really over-the-top content from Katurah, with her having a panic attack, being scared to go into the water, and this leads to this final moment where they're supposed to swim to the boat, to where Jeff kind of goads her into agreeing to swim with everyone else, leading to her getting this very much Suri balance beam style moment, and her getting this like heroic music as she dives. And straight up, again, I personally found this really boring, but I do obviously sympathize with Katurah, and I'm happy that she did overcome her fears, but again, I find it entertaining TV. Anyway, the challenge itself does come down to Austin and Bruce, with Bruce unsurprisingly losing the challenge based on the editing, to where coming into Tribal, clearly Bruce is set up as the one getting the majority of the votes, though the common assumption from everybody, even Bruce himself, is that he's going to play the idol on himself. So while they still want the majority of the votes on him to flush the idol either way, more of the focus of the episode ends up going into who the split is going to be on. Where again, the obvious choice here ends up being Jake, though we do spend a lot of time on this plan that doesn't go through of potentially splitting the votes on Julie, with Katurah talking about how Julie is a massive threat as everyone loves her, which comes out of left field and does completely go against the meta of the perception of mom figures on Survivor, where again here it's being talked as something that will make it likely that she'll win the game, when in reality it seems to be something that makes people upset at you by the end of the game. Though this is a plan that has Emily getting more mastermind content and her selling it to Bruce, which he fully buys into, despite the fact that Emily talks about how this is only a ploy to appeal to his ego and to get him not to play his idol, which again does seemingly work. Though again, I don't know why Emily wants this, but this was pretty strong content for her, but again in a way that felt very reminiscent to the likes of Jesse's content in taking out Noelle, with us getting to see all of her inner thoughts of how she's going to be pulling off this move and getting sole credit for it, which again felt like too good of content here. But then we get Bruce campaigning to Jake about voting out Julie, in which he does end up admitting to his lie from earlier, where you could tell how hurt Jake was by this, and it does lead to more sympathetic content for Jake, of him being frustrated at always being lied to, and him getting emotional on the beach and being disappointed in himself for not being a better player, which again I did really feel for Jake in this instance, though felt like this content was again directly tying into him being a losing finalist. Where we do get to Tribal, where this proceeds to be a major talking point at Tribal, to where it just became clear how bad Jake's game has been, to where while the jury does say that they're feeling bad for him, again, I don't feel like any of that translated to true game respect. But again, all the suspense in this episode did come from, will Bruce play his idol or not? It being pretty clear that he wasn't going to, even though really we never even seeing his perspective of why he wouldn't even use his idol. But obviously he doesn't use it and gets blindsided in a process, with him being the only Julie vote, a result that felt very fitting for Bruce's exit from the game, with him coming off as a pretty doofusy figure on his way out. But I should mention the fact that this result had actually been spoiled the night before by CBS themselves, where the night before the episode aired, they accidentally end up uploading Bruce's final words, which I had seen, which, I mean, straight up could have impacted how I viewed the episode. But even without that, I do feel like it would have been very apparent that Bruce was the boot, just by paying attention to all the other editing trends. But again, with that, we lose Bruce, who was an incredible character on this season. I mean, it is still so surreal to me that this is the guy that got medevaced on day 1 of Survivor 44, as he just feels like a very different person than what I was expecting him to be. Well, straight up, I did kind of expect this more domineering personality. I didn't expect it to be to this extreme, to where literally the entire cast hated him. And when mixing that and the fact that he's also this wacky character at the same time, again, it felt like this weird dichotomy with his character that I just was not expecting. But as a player, I mean, Bruce is pretty terrible. And again, it sucks to say because I do like Bruce, but I feel like he played almost as bad of a game as he possibly could have. I mean, based on exit press, it does seem like he would have been the first boot from the original Bella tribe had they ever gone to Tribal. He also potentially would have been the boot at the swap had they gone to Tribal. He also would have been a likely boot had he been vulnerable at any of the rounds post-merge, yet until his boot, he was only vulnerable in one round, that being the split Tribal twist, a round where he was split onto a tribe with the majority of his original tribe, and even in that instance there was talk about blindsiding him, with the only reason he doesn't get blindsided seeming to be because Kelly didn't approve of it. And again, for me, Bruce's game is terrible, probably one of the worst games I've ever seen for someone that made it this deep into the game, but it's still made for such great TV, and Bruce is still a great character, to where, again, despite him not being a great player, I wouldn't be opposed to seeing Bruce back again down the road. But now for episode 11, which was mostly a strong episode here that felt like this big turn for the season, and where we get this pretty massive vote off that pretty much confirmed the trajectory of the season, even though I felt like the vote off itself was made a bit too apparent from the beginning. But again, the path there was still strong nonetheless. But first off, we do start off with reactions to the Bruce vote, where everyone celebrates back at camp, despite the fact that this is clearly not the best move for everyone to be making. But this does lead to us seeing Emily instantly take credit for the move, revealing to the others how she manipulated Bruce into not playing his idol, which, like, why would you do that? I mean, it really felt ridiculous for her to do so here, where it obviously just alerts everyone to what she's doing in the game and increases the target on her back, while also alerting Julie to the fact that she had been throwing her name out. Where again, this all felt really dumb from a game perspective, and also instantly made me realize that this is probably a setup to Emily's fall later in the episode. We talk about how she does have a big target on her back. But following this, we do get one more time for Katurah, the trash on Bruce, saying that she can finally be in silence, and talks about his lack of self-awareness once again, which was all good for her edit to obviously get her reaction to his boot, really culminating their storyline here. And just as a whole, this episode ends up being a pretty strong one for her. Again, essentially the edit that she needed to really revive her edit after Bruce went home. That really set her up as a contender opposed to Dee by the end of this episode, with her also finally getting personal content again for the first time since the premiere, but this time having her finally open up to the other players, and her revealing this pretty disturbing backstory, finding out that she grew up in a cult and was supposed to marry its leader when she was like 14, which led to her running away, and talks about what inspired her to become this lawyer that advocates for black people, to where she later says that this is a story about redemption and resilience, and all this was just extremely positive content for her, which again felt like the exact type of content that she needed to pop back up into winner contention, especially considering we also later see her relationship with Jake seemingly getting repaired, and them being a bit of a pair in the game at this point, with Jake himself getting the same type of content he's been getting in previous episodes about how he's done being on the bottom and now's the time to play, which again, confessionals like that felt like they were on a never-ending loop for him, though we do get some fun content from this conversation of both being confused over the phrase apple cart, and again, them getting similar content to episode 1, with Katurah once again talking to him about him being a lawyer, while she obviously pretends to not be one, which was fun. And along with that, we do also later get a seemingly random scene scene of Jake and Katurah practicing fire, feeling like a bit of foreshadowing there, which for this season had been strangely absent up to this point. Beyond that, we get a lot more content focusing around the Rebas, with them just outright having the numbers at this point being 4 of the final 7, and we do see them confirm to each other that they want to go to the final 4 together, which obviously essentially meant that they weren't getting to the final 4 together. But this is followed by content surrounding Dee and Austin, where it had been alluded to in previous episodes that there might be a start of this showmance between the two, but here was finally introduced to us properly, with us seeing them bonding while looking at the stars, and we get confessionals about them being interested in each other, with us proceeding to get a flashback to Rob and Amber, which was weird. Though obviously this did make me feel like this could be set up to them both making it to Final Tribal, considering the parallels there. Though also this all brings up the criticism of the fact that why did they just now show us this relationship? Obviously it's really late into the season, and it feels like a relationship that was like brought up here just as it became relevant to the story. That makes this content feel like it's here simply because it has to be here, and not to propel Dee and Austin as characters. Where obviously this is all here to set up the dilemma that Austin faces by the end of the episode, and it's also here to explain how Julie knows to play the idol, which the necessity of this content did feel like a strange aspect of the edit for Dee in particular, who again I was looking at as the frontrunner following this episode. Though at the same time, this was pretty impressive for Dee's game to have Austin talk about how he's okay going to the end with her and her beating him, which again, considering the similar confessional we also got from Julie previously, it does really show you just how much of a stranglehold Dee had in the game at this point. But in the morning, we do end up seeing us getting our gimmick for this episode, and there being a journey, which clearly didn't work out as expected, which made it more of an afterthought by the end of it. But the journey here has one person going on it, which we do get some more bad content for Jake, with him talking about how much he needs to go, and then we see him being first to volunteered, which he ends up saying that he can't afford any more mistakes, only for him to not get picked when they leave it up to random draw instead. And Emily ends up being picked to go, despite the fact that she clearly didn't really want to, and she was very apprehensive here. And again, the journey itself ends up being a pretty quick scene here, though it is used to really feel like this farewell to Emily's arc on this season, feeling this culmination of her storyline, of her talking back about her first confessional, saying that she was wrong, and talks about how she's changed as a person, which again just felt like the show wrapping up this story, making it even more clear that she was being set up for the boot. But the dilemma she faces here ends up being her having to do the puzzle from the Savvy task from the beginning of the season that no one solved, which was strange and clearly a mid-season change here. But if she succeeded here, she would get immunity for the round, while otherwise she would lose her vote, and she ends up obviously not doing it, which makes sense here, as again this seemed to be a pretty difficult puzzle, and for her to risk her vote at Final 7, a very important vote, while also still having a chance of winning immunity through the immunity challenge later on, it really didn't make much sense for really just anyone to go through with this. So where again it just led to this being a bit of a waste of time on the show. But while Emily is gone, we do get a lot of content back at camp that really chronicles us seeing the cracks in the Reba 4 alliance. First starting off by showing us this conversation between Julie and Drew that clearly comes off as frosty and very opposed to the conversation we saw them have in the previous episode, that obviously now very much feels like foreshadowing, where clearly this was the time where they were going to come after each other, with Drew talking about how big of a threat she is, while also talking about how she still has the idol that Austin gave her, which again she never ended up giving back, to where it became pretty obvious that this was going to play a major factor in the show, with them continuously showing that in the previously on segments ever since it happened, which is actually a pretty savage move for Julie to not give the idol back here, one that obviously ends up saving her in this position, though also feels like a major point of contention between the alliance, as you would assume keeping it here would sever trust within the group, making it feel like Julie doesn't trust the others, which I mean, to be fair, she shouldn't considering the events of this episode. But again, I do think it is a questionable call, especially once your alliance kind of confronts you on the fact that you still have it. But following this conversation, we do end up seeing the two start to actually work against each other, with Julie going to Dee, talking about her suspicions of Drew flipping, though despite that the target never really seems to be on Drew, with them wanting to target Emily instead, with Dee in particular saying this in confessional, continuing her track record of openly targeting the person who ends up going home, which straight up Emily is a pretty perfect target for Dee at this point, still keeping the option of potentially working with the Rebas moving forward, while also getting rid of one of the bigger threats in the game, and also someone that is directly associated to Drew and Austin, and through taking her out is obviously isolating them. So again, it just really makes her a perfect target for Dee at this point in the game. But then we cut to content from Drew with him deciding to turn against Julie here, again showing Julie's suspicions as right, and we do end up seeing him approach Katurah and Jake about making the move, and them seeming to be on board, with us also hearing them say that Dee's threat level is going down, which is used to explain why they're targeting Julie instead, which, I mean, you would think theoretically is pretty bad for winning chances here, though I actually felt like it was a pretty good thing for her edit. Again, feeling like them undoing the blatant setup to her winning a jury vote from earlier. That was obviously a major knock against her in that position, but this also leads to good strategic content for Katurah, with her talking about how this is the moment she planned on picking up steam, which definitely propels her edit there. But with Austin on board with this plan as well, really everyone but Dee is in on this plan, which is where we do get some content from Austin, with him clearly being worried about the ramifications of this plan and the effect it would have on his relationship with Dee, with him saying that it would hurt him to blindside her, which really just shows you again how much leverage Dee has on him here, with this episode really just ending up being a pretty terrible look for Austin, with Drew calling him out for being an idiot for giving his idol to Julie to begin with, and we get him talking about how now he has to flush his own idol, which again, all this was not a great look for him, really both as a player and also edit-wise, as this really just sunk his winning chances even more, even though again, I didn't think he was winning by this point anyway. But eventually we do get to the immunity challenge, which ends up being a somewhat interesting one here, of them having to unspool rope to reach the next section, which we've seen before, but I did like the addition of there being a tossing section at the end, to where you had to account for how much rope you needed to grab your bags afterwards, or you would have to adjust how hard you throw to make sure that you had enough rope to grab them, which again, I thought was an interesting aspect of all this, along with the fact that we also get a somewhat interesting puzzle, one that we've seen in team challenges of you creating this arc that creates this word, though here, again, as an individual and considering how many blocks there were, again, this did seem like a pretty difficult task here, and we do get this fun moment from it of Austin finishing first, though had only paid attention to one side of the puzzle, not realizing that he needed to correct the other side, to which Jeff ends up telling him this, though despite that, he ends up continuing to be confused, just standing there, not getting what went wrong, which is a pretty big dodo moment for him. But here we do see Drew end up winning here, and we do get a reward along with that, where you can pick 2 people to go along with him, to which he ends up picking the 2 guys here, to where we have Guys Night 2.0, which was kind of disappointing that we didn't get a similar montage as last time, along with the fact that we didn't get a montage for the women when they were back at camp, where they end up having a spa day, though we end up getting a pretty interesting scene there anyway, of them being just extremely awkward, where both Emily and Julie are obviously aware of the fact that they're coming for each other, and we do get this funny moment of them just awkwardly reading their buffs, and obviously they pretend to create this plan to vote for Jake, even though no one was going with that. But on the reward, we do end up seeing Austin and Drew working on Jake, with them solidifying the plan against Julie, and Jake ends up getting some solid content here, with him talking about how he teaches theater and talks about pretending to be with them, while also getting another confessional that is very reminiscent to the one that he started the episode on. I'm talking about how he's an extra that's been playing a tree, and he's tired of being a tree, and he's finally ready for a supporting role, only for him to be part of the plan that ultimately fails in the episode, which again was a bad look. But this entire scene does end with talk about how Dee can't know about this plan, as if she finds out, Julie will play her idol, and it would be a disaster, taking us to the men returning to camp, and us instantly seeing Austin talk about how he's struggling with lying to Dee, and Dee coming off well here as well, and pulling him away, and instantly picking up on the fact that something is off, with him quickly revealing to her that everyone is voting for Julie. And here we do see Dee clearly not be on board, saying that she can't vote for her, and then campaign to take out Emily, though Austin ends up rebutting this by saying that if Julie stays, it'll bite them in the butt because everyone will be against them. Which makes no sense, as this is a situation where they would be half the players left in the game if that were the case, and they would also still have an idol by their side. But again, Dee does end up getting some pretty strong strategic content here, with her fully talking about how bad it would be for Julie to leave, and proceed to get credit here for saving her, with her ratting this plan back out to Julie, with them now planning on using Julie's idol to take out Emily, which obviously we later see. Though I do feel like Julie acts a bit indignant here, talking about how they should man up and face her at 3, which again, that's just stupid for them to want to do. But I also feel like this leads to some pretty questionable play from Julie, where again, despite the fact she talks about in confessional how no matter what, she's going to play her idol anyway, she still decides to, for some reason, approach Emily and Jake about voting out Austin, which was dumb, as again, this is just so unlikely to work, and by her going to them and attempt to target Austin, this really just makes them aware of the fact that she must know that Drew and Austin has turned on her, which they obviously end up ratting back out, and this really just only opens up the potential of them finding time to split the vote, giving less power to Julie by the time she casts her vote, though again, it doesn't go through and no one ends up splitting their vote, which in itself is pretty insane here. Like, I really don't understand how players have not started to figure out the importance of splitting their votes, especially in a situation like this, where again, you should always at least just split one vote, just in case, but really, this could have easily just screwed over Dee here and exposing her to Drew and Austin, which again, could have caused them to turn on her, but for some reason, instead, we see them buying into the fact that Dee didn't rat them out, which is pure insanity there as well, that she was able to sell it in this position. But this leads to another fake out here of Julie telling Dee that she actually does want to vote Austin out instead of Emily, to which Dee says, "Don't do that, he's my number one," which again, why are you saying that? But for some reason, that isn't used against her, with obviously Julie ending up still voting for Emily, showing Dee's influence on her. But in reality, I do feel like this was a move that was probably the right call for Julie, as and Julie was pretty screwed in the game if she had lost Dee in this position, and by blindsiding Austin and Dee in the process with this move, and knowing how vindictive of a game Dee seems to play, I do feel like this is very much risking your relationship with Dee, which is simply just not worth it at this point, as at that point you would have no real options moving forward. But here we do end up seeing Dee put a lot of faith into Julie, with her deciding to also vote for Julie. Obviously as a plot to keep up the appearances of her not having ratted the plan out, but also pretending like they aren't tight anymore, which gives Julie the sole power on who to take out of the game here, which again is a bit of a risky play for Dee in the case that Julie did make an underhanded move, though again it works out for her. And we do get the tribal where we do end up actually seeing all of the votes here but Julie's, which obviously doesn't happen very often, but the main drama here does come from who Julie's gonna vote for, and we do get some fun from Dee acting shocked when Julie plays her idol, but obviously it does end with Emily getting sniped out of the game here, which was a massive shock to the Edgic community, who came into this episode seemingly thinking that Emily was like the only contender left in the game, which I felt was ridiculous. And while obviously it is sad to lose Emily here, who's a massive character, I kind of was happy at this result, just to see the Edgic community be a bit humbled with just how overconfident they were that she was going to win. So again, at least I got enjoyment out of that, but obviously here we do lose Emily, who again was probably the main character of this season. I do think she was a very important figure on the season, one that has this very strong arc from beginning to end, with her seemingly growing as a person but also as a player along the way as well, and through that ends up being obviously one of the more notable characters of the season. Though I will say I don't know where I really land on Emily as a player in the grand scheme of things, where obviously she's someone that's very much hyped up on the show, though in reality I do feel like she just gave the Rebas a bit too much power. I do feel like she waited a bit too long to make the move, and again, the fact that she gets all the credit for the Bruce blindside, again, to me that's a bad move. Again, that's a move that's potentially getting rid of a number 4U, and again giving the Rebas the outright majority in the following round, where again, while they do end up flipping on each other there, again, like the fact that you're gonna bank on this very solid alliance finally cracking, I think is pure insanity. And again, the fact that she doesn't split her vote at the very end as well, to where again, even if they didn't know that she had an idol, you should still always be worried about a shot in the dark. Like again, I do question Emily's overall game ability, but I would still say she's one of the better players on this season, where obviously while she got very lucked out at the first tribal, I will say like most of her game beyond that is solid, even though I don't really agree with certain strategic decisions she made, and also again made herself a bit too big of a threat, but also at the same time, again, she gets idled out of the game. Now to be fair, I don't know how her game would have gone beyond this. I don't expect her to have made it that much further, considering how it did seem a lot of people picked up on the fact that she is a massive threat in the game, but again, she does get sniped out of the game through a single vote, so again, that's something to give her credit for as well. But beyond that, again, like she was still such a massive presence on this season, one of the main characters of this season, and Jeff Probst even claimed that she was one of his favorite players of all time, where again, I would be pretty shocked if we don't see Emily again at some point down the road. Now for episode 12, a solid penultimate episode here that, while the boot was pretty foreshown and kind of made the overall result of the season a foregone conclusion, I still found this episode to be a pretty interesting one, especially considering its portrayal of Dee, with it really highlighting her really strong gameplay across the episode. By the way, we do start off with a lot of time being focused around the reaction to the previous vote, with us seeing the Reba 4 completely fractured here, though all this does lead to some really strong content for Dee, with her again getting away with lying about not having told Julie to play her idol, which again leads to content clearly showing her being the most in tune of this being a game, with her talking about how she has to now be awkward in front of everyone and says that she can act for a few more days. And we see her swearing on her mom in the process, talking about willing to swear on everything as her family's going to be happy when she wins, which again just shows how far she'll go. A major aspect of Dee's edit that gets reiterated by the end of this episode. But here we do end up seeing Austin and Drew fully buying into Dee's lies, of them solidifying their final 3 deal, which, while it does make sense of why Austin wants to go to the end with Dee, I feel like it is pretty insane that Drew also wants to go to the end with her. And it's something that he does reiterate in his exit press, which again just shows you how much of a stranglehold Dee seem to have in the game at this point. This does lead to some negative content for Drew, with him again falling for Dee's tricks, but also coming off as really indignant over Julie having saved herself. So we do get some pretty awkward content from Julie joining the conversation by throwing herself on top of them, essentially tackling them, which has Drew getting this funny confessional saying, "Get off me." And we also get a later conversation between the two, with neither of them buying into each other's spiel, making it pretty clear they were going to come for each other by the end of the episode. But really, Drew ends up getting the blame for the crack in the Reba 4 in the edit, with Julie openly blaming him in confessional, saying what happened to Reba Strong, Drew happened, which again felt like this overtly negative tone for Drew's edit that felt like him being set up for a fall here, where we do end up seeing Julie and Dee talking about him being the mastermind, with again Dee seeming to have her head in the right space here and wanting to separate Drew and Austin, which in turn would have both Austin and Julie in the game as people undyingly loyal to her, which may have a pretty obvious boot pretty much from the beginning. Though, I mean, I think you could argue the fact that was this actually the best move, considering Drew did seemingly want to take her to the end. Well, again, how much did the likes of Katurah and Jake want to? Though, at the same time, I do think Drew is probably someone that can at least create more of an argument for a win. And I understand why you wouldn't really trust Drew's word in this instance, to where I still agree with her making the move at this point. But anyway, the next morning, we do see the start of an idol hunt, with Katurah being the first to search and talking about how she needs to find it to show that she's not a passive player and show her evolution in the game, only for her to not find it, which felt pretty damning for her edit. Along the fact that we do see Austin and Dee catching her as well, to which we do get a funny moment of the show acting as if Katurah is about to find an idol, with the typical music build up, only for it to be Austin finding her and jump scaring her, which was fun. But following this, we do get to the reward challenge. That was a new challenge here, and them having to walk on a barrel using ropes and do this pretty unique slide puzzle, where again, nice to see them try to do new things here, but Austin ends up blowing everyone away in this challenge, where he instantly ends up picking Dee as expected, with him then proceeding to pick Katurah as the other option, leaving Drew behind to babysit Julie, with him claiming that there's no way that Julie and Jake are going to be working together, which he instantly gets proven wrong on. But the reward itself ends up having them get on a helicopter and flying to a sand spit for a picnic, which the show really hypes this up as it's like once in a lifetime experience, which I would have just found really lame. This does end up leading to Dee talking about her feelings for Austin, with us hearing the producer asking questions, which again felt very reminiscent of the same style of content surrounding Matt and Franny in the previous season. But this leads to Austin also getting his personal content finally, of him talking about his confidence issues as a kid and him being happy that someone as cool as Dee likes him, which again still has even his personal content being connected to Dee, which obviously didn't really move the needle on his edit for me. But finally, throughout all this, we do have Katurah talking about being the third wheel, while talking also about they're in Lover's Lane, while she'll be thinking about winning the million. Something that can be interpreted as a winner quote, though again, I feel like considering her undermining previously, it really didn't do much for me, and instead it kind of just felt more so like set up to her being a foil for Dee and Austin down the road. But meanwhile, back at camp, we do get a lot of Drew just moping around, again playing into Drew's downfall edit, with him getting upset that no one ever picks him for a reward and being frustrated at how he's taking the social heat from Julie and that he can't look for the idol himself as he has to follow them, even though he doesn't proceed to follow them, leading to him cooking rice and proceeding to throw the lid in frustration. And then we also see the helicopter flying above them and Drew saying life's unfair, where really just all this makes him come off as really petulant. And through this, Jake ends up having a pretty good look here and coming off as the antithesis to Drew, really embracing the experience. And again, in conflict with what Austin just said, he does start start to work with Julie, calling himself the fun babysitter, to where him and Julie actually go idol hunting, to where he ends up talking about needing the idol, and unlike Katurah, actually ends up finding it here, and is given a pretty short task of having to find it in the tribe raft, which was pretty boring, though it does lead to some strange content here surrounding him doing so in his underwear, and him telling a story about him doing the same during a play, which was something, but he ends all of this by calling himself a wolf in goat's clothing. I mean, I saw people really latching on to thinking that this was setting up his win, when in reality, I feel like it was the complete opposite, especially considering how undermined he is later in the episode. I really felt like this was meant to give off the opposite impression, showing him wrong in this instance, and the fact that he actually is the GOAT. But anyway, we get to the immunity challenge, and what ends up being another new challenge, but not really, and it just being a modification of a challenge that we've seen plenty of times in the past, of them having to put their foot on a beam where they have to balance something at the end, where previously they had to balance a vase, though now they have to bounce a ball, which, I mean, didn't really shake up the challenge that much, but the challenge does come down to Dee and Austin, where we do see them talking smack, aka blatantly flirting, where Dee ends up winning the challenge here, but we do continue to get more of their banter back at camp, with the two claiming that they're going to beat each other, implying that they're going to have to compete against each other at some point down the road. But then we proceed to get a lot of content surrounding Jake, again continuing off of his idol find. We do have him talking about how Julie would be the easy move here, but it doesn't really add much to his resume, to where this is something that I do very much respect from Jake, and how hard he is playing to try to win the game, to where while he does fail at most things he tries, again, I at least respect that he is trying. Yeah, at least attempting to win here. But we do have him going to Julie and telling her that he wants to blindside Drew and wants to pull in Katurah into the plan, actively wanting to set up a 3-3 vote to gain even more credibility there. Essentially doing the exact same thing he did during the Caleb vote, which again is cool to see him trying to put a plan together, though it's followed up by us getting him completely undermined. Where we have Jake saying that he doesn't want Dee involved in this plan as she could ruin it, to where we hear Julie talk about Jake doesn't know that Dee is already in on this plan, and it would be 4 votes anyway, and making this seem like a vote that was again already in action and something that Jake started himself. Also, we have him pulling in Katurah and even saying in confessional that he's doing this for redemption for the Caleb move, and that could be ludicrous to rely on Katurah again, but he trusts her, only for us to cut to Katurah telling Dee about the plan, them laughing and celebrating over how Drew's going home, which again felt like this complete dunking for Jake in making this entire plan feel like something that was again just him falling into someone else's plan. But here again, we do get a lot of content surrounding Dee, who talks about why she needs Drew to go, but does struggle with the idea of blindsiding Austin, finally saying that she could care less about lying to Drew. But through this obviously puts her in the exact same dilemma that Austin was in the previous episode, where her telling Austin would probably lead to him playing his amulet on Drew, considering this is the last time he can play it anyway, which would obviously ruin the entire plan, and this obviously leads up to Dee not telling Austin here, again making the move that is best for her individual game and showing her doing the complete opposite of what Austin did in the previous episode, where she even mentions the parallels between this and what Austin did. And again, when in the last episode the show was really showing Austin's decision as a bad move and a really emotional one, here we have Dee doing the complete opposite, fixing the mistake that Austin made in the game, and again clearly being this major positive for Dee's edit and really playing into her overall themes there. But in the lead up to Tribal, we do end up getting some really cocky content from Austin and Drew, with them calling themselves one of the greatest duos in Survivor history, up there with the greats and Steven and JT and Tyson and Gervais. Again, my favorite Survivor player, Gervais. But either way, we get the Tribal with Drew also openly saying that his alliances are locked in and that he has a clear vision to the end, which practically everyone should have that at this point. But why are you openly saying this in front of everyone? Again, it just feels like more content that's blatantly setting you up for a fall. But either way, we get to the vote. We're obviously the 4-2 vote against Drew, and Austin ends up playing his amulet on himself, to where we do get some strong reactions from the duo as the votes come up, with Austin clearly feeling like an idiot here. Obviously, we have to cap up the episode here, the reveal that they're going to a new island to start over, with it's just being like the other New Era seasons, which is still pointless. But either way, we do end up losing Drew, who I thought was a pretty great character on this season. Again, I think he's a great confessionalist. He definitely has this very articulate way of speaking that I thought was really interesting. He also seemed to be a very savvy player, to where while I think he definitely had some social faux pas at points, again, him not being able to secure Emily earlier on in the game, him obviously burning his relationship with Julie, like, I do still think Drew is a pretty solid player. I mean, we do see him being the one to come up with plans for the Reba 4 and really seem to lead the charge in the Kelly vote, which was the biggest move they pulled off together. Now, I do question his win equity, to where I would not be shocked if he would have lost if he got to the end, but again, I do think he is a solid player, and one thing, again, I thought brought fun content to the show, or even outside of his funny way of speaking. I did find his petulance throughout the end portion of his game to also be really funny. Again, his fight with Jake, his confessionals about how much he doesn't like Julie, again, all that was really fun content, to where for me, again, I still found them to be pretty entertaining here. But now we're here at the finale, which ends up actually being a pretty strong one. So while the final result was one that I found pretty predictable by the end of it, it does have one of the most insane final 5 votes we've ever had, and some interesting conclusions to this season's stories along the way. But it all starts off with Jeff talking to the audience, introducing the finale, and blatantly telling us the themes of the season, which was all really strange. But obviously we have the players arriving on their new island, where we obviously get Austin's reaction to the Drew blind side, with him taking it pretty well here, instantly accepting Dee's apology, to where there really isn't much conflict between the two for the rest of the game, with them pretty much just working in lockstep, which again did surprise me that we literally saw no blowback to any of this on Dee's game, to where I do think it really just shows you how strong Dee's relationship was with him, where again, considering how Dee was this massive jury threat and was openly talked about as one, the fact that again he never considers cutting her in this end game despite her lying to him, in a position where again, like, he should know that she now has leverage over him in front of a jury just inherently, again, I do think comes off as pretty impressive for Dee's game here. Though all this does earn the ire of Katurah, who does end up targeting the showmance here, not wanting to go to Final 4 with them, and talking about how she doesn't want the fumble this close to the end, which obviously makes her entire finale here even that much more tragic, as she pretty much just screws up everything she tries to do here. Then we cut to the next morning, where we do have a combination lock at the end of the beach, being the typical challenge for her advantage that we've done in the new era, with the challenge itself being the return of the counting challenge that we actually haven't seen in a while. So I actually was kind of interested in seeing it here, to which we do end up seeing Austin and Dee clearly working together, which, I mean, seemed kind of too obvious there, to where you would think that that would further paint this target on their back. But clearly Jake ends up being set up to win this challenge here, to where he talks about how this could put him back in the game, and we see him detailing a strategy about memorizing the numbers in relation to the Survivor winners, leading to flashbacks to JT, Denise, and shockingly Gabler. But again, we have Jake winning an advantage in the immunity challenge here, which in typical Jake fashion, it doesn't work out for him, even though the edit does again prop this up as this could be his $1 million. All meant to be this really tragic content here, with Jake's overall run in this finale in particular just being really sad to see, with everything just feeling like it was kicking him when he's down. But we get to the immunity challenge, which obviously ends up being this massive obstacle course where Jake gets a lead due to his advantage, only for him to forget his keys, allowing Austin to take the lead from him. Though we do get it being pretty close at the puzzle, which ends up being the Michelle Tower puzzle, to where Austin does still end up winning, though that is after Jake had been missing a piece, being again this continuation of this massive Charlie Brown content for Jake, though it does lead to him getting taken on reward by Austin, leading to him getting even more Dodo content here, with him leaking to Austin that he has an idol, something that Austin instantly rats out, which causes this massive train wreck of events for this round, which, I mean, straight up, I don't even know if this is inherently a bad move to make people know that you have the idol, as obviously it makes it less likely they're going to vote for you, and allows Jake to then play the idol on Katurah, which could come off as a more impressive move, though obviously, again, like every plan that Jake comes up with, I mean, this plan obviously ends up being a bit of a disaster, but again, it leads to one of the most complex votes in Survivor history here, being one where pretty much everyone is just playing so poorly, and no one is on the right page, though again, to be fair, a lot of that seemed to be due to Jake's idol, where it led to everyone just changing their plans at the last second. But here we do see Austin and Jake at the sanctuary agreeing to vote for Julie, all while back at camp we do see Katurah campaigning against Dee to Julie, to which Julie ends up refusing to go for Dee, and instead gets Katurah to agree to vote for Jake, with it seeming like Jake would have actually been the boot here had he not had the idol, which seems misguided. Like, why are you targeting Jake, the guy that probably has the least amount of win equity out of this final 5? Like, that was always a strange decision, where it's like Julie says that, oh, it's because Jake's coming after me, but it's like, Jake can't come after you after this. It's like, yeah, he could throw you in fire, but most people are going to throw you in fire. So it just felt like a misguided move even inherently. And again, it really ends up costing Julie the game here, and the fact that she continues to vote for Jake even after everyone tells her that Jake has an idol. Which again, credit to Dee and the fact that she had such a strong bond where Julie just was not willing to vote for her even when it would have saved her game here. And then we do see Austin telling Dee about the idol, in which they decide to change their vote onto Katurah, something that again Julie doesn't get on board with, meaning that they only have 2 votes on Katurah at this point, all while we see Jake telling Katurah about his idol, but not revealing to her that he intends on playing the idol on her, something that causes Katurah to not realize that obviously she is safe here, leading to her making a very rash move that we see later. So obviously Katurah does deserve a lot of the blame for that later decision, though I do think this was also a plan that, again, is Jake being a bit cute. I do feel like it's Jake really just trying to squeeze every little bit of jury potential out of this by having Katurah be shocked when he plays the idol on her. But I do feel like at the end of the day, the move would have been to just loop her in on this and allow you to be this like really solid duo at this point. But again, it ends up all being for naught. But here we do end up seeing Katurah again campaigning against Dee here to Jake, finally exactly stating what ends up happening in the following round as the reason to take her out in this instance, which considering Katurah is the one that actually ended up messing up this plan, it really does solidify her loss moving forward and her not going through this plan that is clearly in her best interest. But while Jake seemed hesitant at first, he does actually end up going through with this, something that I was a bit surprised to see, as I really did feel like he was going to go for Julie, especially considering the fact that again Julie just felt like the obvious boot here from an editing perspective. So again, I thought it would have made a lot more sense for Jake to just go back on his word and that be the reason why Julie went out, but for it to actually be Katurah changing her vote at the last second is again a pretty insane aspect of this vote, where had the votes played out as expected coming into Tribal, Dee actually would have gone out here, which I am pretty disappointed at that being the case considering how Dee was again in such a great spot for most of this season and had these 2 fully loyal allies around her at the time of the final 5, to where I really thought she was perfectly set up to play this extremely dominant game with very few holes that would have put her in contention to possibly even being a top 5 winner for me. But this ends up being the start of what I consider a pretty terrible finale for Dee that sadly ended up knocking her out of that group. So while I do think she was unlucky in the fact that Jake obviously had an idol here that makes this vote obviously that much more disorganized, I think for me, again, I do have to consider it a knock the fact that she almost gets voted out here, was going to get voted out had Katurah not changed her mind at the last second. And I do think the other major knock for me is the fact that coming into Tribal, we do see Austin changing his mind in voting for Katurah and wanting Julie out instead, something we see Dee being unwilling to do, which is all around bad. Again, seeming to again go against Dee's story about how she's willing to make these cutthroat moves that others weren't, and it's kind of being an indication to me that she's not as cutthroat of a player as she had been portrayed. But also, again, this was a life or death situation for Dee coming into this, where again, even she should know that if the idol does somehow get played on Katurah, as it later does, she definitely could be in potential danger there. To where again, it just feels like Dee gets saved here kind of against her will. And she doesn't want Austin to be voting Julie out, yet that was actually the vote that ends up saving her here, along with the fact that again, she really gets saved by Katurah switching her vote at the last second, despite wanting Dee out, which all that is just really, really bad play from Dee, which again, I think you can justify to a degree due to the fact that again, it was a very unlucky circumstance that caused all this to happen, but again, her reaction to that is just absolutely terrible here, to where she was so close to going home. But also, again, this is obviously still a very bad round for Katurah here as well, for her to again set up this entire Dee plan, putting it in action, and then switching her vote at the very last second, which, I mean, based on the show, I really didn't understand why she thought this was the better move to make. Now, based on exit press, it does very much seem like Austin convinced her to vote for Julie, where Austin had told her previously that he was voting for Julie, and this got Katurah eventually to think that Julie was the safer option to vote for over Dee. But that entire move is still based around a massive misread here, and her thinking that she's going to get the majority of the votes, even though I don't even get how she thought she was getting the majority of the votes, as from her perspective, again, like she thought Austin was potentially voting for Julie, and she didn't trust that Jake was voting for Dee. But again, is Jake really voting for her? Especially considering all of his talk about wanting to make a big move, and really just outright, there's not many votes left outside that. That could be potentially going for her. All this felt like just kind of misguided misguided here in her flipping her vote here, as to me, it doesn't really make a difference. And all her vote does here is potentially cause this really bad scenario for her where Dee stays and Julie goes. Again, it was either a situation where she was screwed anyway, or guarantees that Dee goes home in this situation. So I do feel like Katurah, even though I get her rationale a bit more after Exopress on why she flips here, I still think it's an all-around bad move. But anyway, this obviously leads up to Tribal, where Jeff calls out Jake for squandering the lead and says he had another missed opportunity due to missing a piece. And it really just felt like Jeff was kind of trashing on Jake here, which Jeff's treatment of Jake throughout this finale ends up being kind of funny. But again, the vote here obviously ends up being pretty insane here, with, again, Dee voting for Katurah, Jake voting for Dee, Julie voting for Jake, all while Katurah and Austin end up independently switching their votes onto Julie. Again, just really bizarre that no one was able to get on the same page here to really get this really insane 2-to-1 vote. Really unprecedented in English language Survivor here, with also getting the insanity of Jake playing his idol on Katurah as well, which in itself leads to a lot of funny moments, from Katurah yelling no at that instance, seemingly recognizing the mistake that she had made right away. We also have Jake doing a Tony impersonation while playing his idol, something that Jeff did not seem too pleased at. And we also have him yelling yes when the Katurah vote comes out, only for his name to then come up, which ends up being funny there. But again, it all culminates in Julie getting taken out here with only 2 votes against her. Again, a pretty insane result there, to which she then proceeds to follow that up by telling Katurah to go to law school after she's voted out, which was also really funny. But again, we lose Julie here, who I think was a really interesting player here, obviously, like being the mom of the cast, and despite that, not really having this stigma that is typically plagued against moms on Survivor, of people being upset at them for backstabbing them, where here again, it felt like she did seem to have a lot of win equity had she gotten to the end. For a while, I do think her versus Dee would have been, again, a bit rocky. I do think she seems like a pretty likely winner against most other people. I do think that is pretty impressive, where like it does seem like she played a major role into the Reba's success and getting people convinced that the fact that the Rebas weren't as close as they were, and also having these connections with the other side. And again, it felt like there were definitely impressive aspects of her game. That being said, I don't feel like she plays this round particularly well, and she essentially ends up, to a degree, voting herself out by voting for Jake here and not being willing to turn on Dee. She also obviously needed an idol to save herself, and now that she would not have had in her possession had not been for Austin handing her the idol on a whim a few rounds before that, to where, again, I think there's definitely things to qualm here, but I think Julie definitely has impressive aspects to her game and was also a pretty fun character. Again, I thought she had some pretty fun reactions to things, so where while she ends up being the most under-edited of the endgamers here, she still got a pretty sizable edit, to where I did mostly find her to be a likable presence on this season. But with that, we then move on to the final 4 round, where instantly we see some fighting between Jake and Katurah, obviously over Katurah messing up the plan, which, again, she puts the blame onto Jake here, saying that he should have told her about the idol, which, I mean, to be fair, he should have, but still, I mean, obviously, I feel like this is a lot of Katurah just deflecting the blame from herself, as obviously her complete misread on Jake is something to factor in here as well. But then we get to the final immunity challenge, which ends up being a new challenge, kind of, where, again, it really is just kind of a mix mash of 2 previous challenges, mixing up the typical Operation Balance build of you having to stack bowls, adding the aspect of there being a tripwire you have to go across that we typically see in the domino challenge, where, again, not entirely unique here, but here we see Dee in the lead for really the entire challenge, though Jake is on her heels the entire time until the very end, where he accidentally knocks over his entire stack. Again, feel like a pretty typical Jake moment there, but then we follow that with another ridiculously humorous moment here from Jake, of him, again, clearly in frustration, trying to get his bowls back to start so he can start over, to which through that he ends up stepping on his cage, to which Jeff yells at him that if you break it, you're out, and what do you know, the cage breaks, leading to Jake getting DQ'd from the challenge here, with Jeff clearly being annoyed at him, which again plays into this continuing tragic story for Jake. And we do get this like really sorrow confessional from him after the challenge, talking about how he's still fighting, and while he's got a snowball's chance in hell, the snowball keeps going, which, I mean, really is just the story of Jake, that he will just keep on continuing to try way. And again, he is going to fail. Like almost everything he does leads to failure, but again, he will keep on going, which again, to me, it just makes it strange that at this point in the season, we still had people that were thinking that Jake was actually going to win, when all we've seen from him is him continuing to fail over and over and over again. Or again, like people that actually thought that Jake was winning here just felt like the people's falling this same trap of rooting for this underdog figure. But either way, Dee ends up winning immunity here, with Jake giving her time to talk about her family again, which pretty much felt like this full confirmation that, yeah, the season's leading up to a Dee win. But I do think the path there was a little bit surprising to me, where again, I was fully thinking that Katurah was more likely to get to the end than Austin, with her being more set up as this opposition to Dee, though we don't get that, where we do see them return to camp, with it being set right away that Dee wants to get Katurah out and is going to send in Jake against her, so that Austin doesn't get the chance to go into fire in front of the jury, which is what ends up actually happening here. Where again, we do get some intrigue from Jake begging Dee to put him in the challenge, and Austin seeing that Jake isn't that good and trying to convince her to throw him into the challenge, which straight up, I fully thought that's what was going to happen. I did think that Austin was going to throw himself in the fire with Katurah, and I thought it was going to backfire on Austin, and that Katurah would end up winning it. To have this more interesting final tribal setup, where here we do get strong content from Katurah, with her getting heroic music as she makes a fire in practice. Though again, clearly that was here to set up suspense, as in reality this ends up being pretty straightforward. But let's get a Jake versus Katurah fire making challenge here, where Jake pretty much easily wins here, with Katurah never really seeming to have much of a lead, which I mean in essence felt like this great culmination to Jake's story, with him finally getting a win here. So while he wasn't going to win this season, he finally gets something going his way, to which he gets this great personal content here talking about wanting to go back in time and telling his younger self that he could do it. Oh well, again, Katurah also gets a great farewell here with her revealing that she's a lawyer to everybody, which leads to this big reaction. And like straight up, I really like Katurah on this season. I think Katurah was a fantastic character. Obviously her being the straight man to Bruce's wackiness that had her like one-sided rivalry with him, and leading to a lot of this season's humor, and mixing out of the fact that she has obviously this very sympathetic background and seems to be a really interesting player. Again, I really feel like Katurah is all you would want from a Survivor player. Now, I do think the way she plays the game ends up being a really ineffective one, obviously, where I've seen a lot of the discourse on like Katurah being a really, really bad player here for enabling the Rebas and obviously messing up the plan to take out Dee at the last second. And like, to be fair, I would agree with that, but I do think an interesting thing about Katurah's game to me is that she was enabling the Rebas very much actively, like not because she was just kind of folding to what they were doing, but because she realized the fact that this group is probably going to crash eventually, and then once they do, I can be the person they take towards the end where I can exploit those cracks. And I do feel like that's an interesting strat here, especially considering like how bad of a position she came in from the original Bellow tribe. But at the end of the day, obviously it is still a strat that is largely based around kind of just hoping that this majority group eventually breaks. And while Katurah again did seem to be somewhat integral in a lot of the Reba's plans, I don't think she would win if she got to the end. Now I know she's talked about how she would have had this big speech that she thinks would have convinced the jury to vote for her. However, I do feel like if she got to the end against any of the Rebas, I do feel like the Rebas would just fight back on her claims about how she was making all these moves, to where I don't feel like it would work out for her. But again, you never really know. But yeah, I think Katurah is a really interesting player here. Again, one that, again, I don't agree with the strategy that she overall played with, but I do at least respect the fact that she did play the game intentionally and was also a fantastic character to boot, to where, again, I just really liked Katurah on this season. But with that, we get to the final three, where here we obviously have Dee, Jake, and Austin. Where again, I was fully expecting Dee and Jake to make it to final three here, though I was pretty shocked at Austin making it, as again, I did feel like he had a pretty shallow edit for most of this season, largely focusing around advantages and not giving him much depth on him as a person, which, considering just how much I thought he had no chance at winning this season due to that style of content, it did completely sap any suspense for me on who is winning here. As again, like, while I was very confident at Dee winning against really anybody, I do feel like if Katurah was there at least would have been this competition edit wise, where who knows if Katurah could have out-talked Dee, which, I mean, to be fair, I mean, it wouldn't be that tough to do, considering what we see Dee do at Final Tribal. But again, I just found it to be a strange editing choice here, and giving Austin as shallow of an edit as he had, considering how much this final tribal is largely set up as Dee versus Austin. But obviously we do get this typical final date breakfast here, with us also getting the jury speak segment that they've done a lot in recent seasons, though strangely they did end up mixing that in with a bit of a rites to passage-esque sequence of us getting to hear the players talk about each of the jury members, which again, just kind of strange to see this style of content coming back here. But again, coming into the final tribal, Dee was obviously winning. It was just a matter of by how much, where final tribal itself I did find to be mostly boring, to be honest, where while it did include a lot of back and forth between Dee and Austin, again, to me it didn't really matter because of the edit, to where it's just kind of obvious where this was going to conclude. And we also get just kind of a lot of boring questions here. Again, the players being asked about their experiences and what they learned and what they were most scared of, where it's like, I don't care. And again, I just found myself so bored during the first half of this tribal, especially considering how much Jeff claimed it was going to be a battle, which, I mean, obviously the final result surely resulted in that. I do think Austin had a pretty strong final tribal performance here, all while Dee had a pretty lackluster one that led to that result. But again, it wasn't really enough to truly prop up this tribal to me. But again, straight up, I just don't think Dee had that good of a performance here. I think she actually stumbled at a lot of questions, though I think the real saving grace for her is the fact that she actually had a really good game to back it up, to where it really allowed her to have these big reveals to dish out that kind of undermined Austin along the way, and her revealing that she knew that Julie was getting votes when she was getting voted out and didn't warn Julie there, but obviously talks about the big one that really sunk Austin's chances, and her revealing that he did tell Julie to play the idol, which Austin constantly reiterates how much he didn't think she did so, which was just a bad look for him, to where, again, that was strong, but really the rest of it just felt like Dee kind of just stumbling throughout, like literally multiple times, not even properly answering the question, just saying same as the previous person that answered. We have her claiming that she got there due to luck and was just lucky to have started out on Reba. She calls out Bruce for saying that he should have played his idol, which that just felt like her taunting him. When asked for a decision that she made with only her brain and not her heart, she gives a non-answer and saying that she played with both together and it wasn't strategic and was always authentic, which, I mean, to be fair, plays into the theme of the season of authenticity. But really, again, to me, just terrible answers here that, again, made it seem as if she just like stumbled her way into the good position she was in. Oh, well, again, I do think Austin has a pretty solid tribal here, with him having some pretty good talking points and talking about how he let Dee be the bigger threat and how he pulled in Emily and led the Kelly vote. He also talks about being the only one to not get his name written down, which, while I personally would have still voted for Dee by the end, I do think Austin puts together, again, a really strong argument here. Though, again, Dee does have some solid rebuttals at points to these, but again, I was just at the end of the day not really shocked by Dee's win here, to where the only thing that really surprised me was how close the vote ended up being. Where obviously, like, I thought it could be a 7-1, it could be a 6-2, but instead we actually get a 5-3 here, where obviously Jake gets 0 votes, which not unexpected, though you get some shock at there being a third Austin vote here, with the show pretending like it could be a tie. No, it obviously still ends up with Dee winning, essentially getting the votes of the women minus Kendra, but plus Caleb, while Austin gets Drew and Bruce, but seemingly pulls over Kendra at the last second here, which I think really shows you the strength of his final trial performance. But really, just overall, I think a Dee win here is a pretty solid conclusion to the season, where obviously her strong play in the last couple episodes before the finale and her dominating positioning beforehand leaves her as a really strong winner and a pretty satisfying winner gameplay wise. Though I do think as a whole this season, though I do feel like the presentation of that can be a bit strange at points, where obviously while the tail end of the season does show why Dee won, I do feel like the rest of the season is more so focused on why others lost and then showing Dee in relation to that. Where obviously we see like Lulu being a complete mess. We see Bello not being able to get it together, and we see like mistakes that other people make that we get to see her react to, the likes of a Sifu, a Sean, a Julie, Austin, where again, it feels like the edit obviously going out of their way to show her as better players than them, but still makes it feel like the storytelling itself is more so about the mistakes that other people are making that she just so happens to be doing right, which again, I do think is a bit of a strange portrayal of your winner here, the one I'm not really that opposed to. Again, I don't feel like the story of the season has to be purely revolved around the winner, which I think is obviously commonly a misconception about how a winner is portrayed, is that they're always going to be the main character of the season, when again, they're simply just not. some of the time, and I think that's okay. They don't need to be, and it's actually better off if they're not. Or again, a season is not simply the conclusion. The season is the story as a whole. And while again, I think Dee is still a satisfying conclusion to this season, she's not the end all be all of the season. To where while there definitely were people out there that Dee's edit wasn't as in your face as it could have been, I do feel like I personally do prefer a winner edit that's a bit more subdued, though at the same time, I do think it really just shows kind of the gender biases in Survivor's editing style, where obviously while you do have under-edited male winners and the likes of again a Bob, a Gabler, a Chris Underwood, it feels like most times that the winner gets this like big in your face edit that's constantly present. It's always with the male winner, where the female winners just simply just don't get that style of edit. And again, it could have been very refreshing to see Dee get that style of edit, though really I just feel like it's probably an edit that I don't think most winners should probably get. But anyway, I guess I should also mention the after show, which I mean straight up I just found kind of boring. I really just don't feel like this one did much for me, to where outside me cringing at how much Jeff seemed to love Drew and us getting this like montage of his numerous literary references, and also Jeff being very self-congratulatory about bringing back the auction. Again, I really didn't find much from it that notable, but again, with that, we'll still wrap up the season by talking about the final three, starting it off with Jake. And again, Jake is such a likable presence on this season. I really like Jake and his story here, though obviously it is a story of failure. It is one where he constantly fails at almost everything he tries to do, and again, he finally gets that one real win at the end of winning fire making, which is this great capper to his story, but it is still mostly a season filled with failure. And through that, I don't particularly look at Jake as that good of a player in terms of like the game he played on this season, as again, it is a pretty bad one where again he's just failing everything he's doing. But I do think at the end of the day, like, I think Jake is an interesting player, though. I think he's one that definitely has potential. I mean, he definitely demonstrates some game ability here, and it feeling like he can create these plans that are the optimal moves for him. He just struggles the execution of those plans, to where it seems like he like recognizes how to win the game and how to get a jury to like him and respect him, but just is not able to actually do those things, which is obviously an issue. But again, I'll say that I thought Jake was a great character on this season, had some really funny confessionals, and again, just the entire Charlie Brown aspect of his story ends up being pretty notable as well. Next up, we have the runner-up in Austin, who, as I previously said, again, I'm shocked that he was the runner-up considering his very shallow edit, but again, Austin's also a pretty likable presence here. I really have nothing bad to say about Austin. He seems like a nice, likable guy. He pretty much played the game pretty much as I expected him to. Again, he was my winner pick coming into the season. Again, I'm shocked he actually got second by the end of it, but again, he pretty much was able to do what I wanted him to do, of be this savvy, social, and strategic player while also being decent enough at challenges, while also being able to give off this impression to the others that he isn't that smart in the game or isn't that much of a threat physically, to where again, like, I feel like as a whole, like, I feel like Austin did a very good job on this season in managing his threat level. He again avoids being voted for the entire season. While he was left out on a couple votes towards the end, again, he's still in a pretty powerful position for most of the game. Like, Strip, I think Austin is one of the better runner-ups in the history of the show, to where again, like, his game is very solid in its own right. Again, him being in the majority lines for most of the season, him pulling off some pretty decent moves, especially in the early merge phase of the game, him getting 3 votes to win, again, being extremely close to a tie. Again, I think there's a lot to like from Austin's game. Obviously, his major downside is, one, the fact that he gave his IO to Julie, which I think really set the stage for him losing credibility in the end game, and also the fact that obviously he was just too low to D, which is a major issue. But again, despite those things, I do think Austin comes out of this looking like a pretty solid player here. But with that, let's get to the winner in D, who, again, edit-wise, I've kind of said my piece. I do feel like she has an interesting edit, one that is flawed for sure, but just the least flawed of this season, to where to me that was kind of the giveaway of her winning. As a player, again, I was so close to having her in my like truly elite winner tier, to where, I mean, like, I don't think she was ever in contention to like topple Kim in any way, though I do think she was in the ballpark of someone like an Earl Cole. But I do feel like this finale just kind of sunk that. Again, her being really lucked out in that final 5 round, her not being willing to cut Julie at the end, her losing jury votes at Final Tribal. I feel like there's a lot not to like in this end game here, to where, again, I think she's closer to top 10, probably cracks it, but I do feel like it was an underwhelming final stretch of her game. But again, it's still a very impressive game. Again, her being in a dominant position for pretty much the entire game, her being essentially the leader of the Reba Alliance, being looked at as the leader by the others, yet somehow still not being directly targeted despite like that. To where even at the final 5, where again she could have gone home, she was really only being targeted by 2 of that final 5. Now, straight up, I do think there are points where I don't necessarily agree with her strategic decision making. Again, I don't love what she did in episode 4. I don't like her targeting J. Maya when she did, but really, I feel like she's able to overcome that because of her social ability. I feel like Dee is a pretty masterful social player on this season. While I don't think strategic ability is really her strong suit, she's still strategic enough to pull off these blindsides and make these moves that are solely in her best interest at points. So where, again, I do think she comes off as a very impressive player here. Now, as a character, she was just kind of fine. Now, her edit did obviously have this like minor villainous tinge to it, to where mixing that of her really bubbly personality, I think it led to a kind of interesting dichotomy at points and how she was being portrayed, where like she definitely wasn't straight up boring on the show, though obviously there were just other more interesting characters along the way, but still an entertaining enough presence, one that again played a very, very strong game. So where again, I think Dee is a very satisfying winner on this season. But with that, that is the entirety of Survivor 45, a season that again I'm coming out of being relatively high on. Again, of the new era, I do think this is the best season of the show. I do think this is the best season by a decent bit. I think it's a season that is probably the most consistent. So there's obviously episodes here and there that I can call out as not being particularly great. I do feel like as a whole, this felt like a massive improvement for the new era. Again, while still having a lot of the typical tropes that I don't particularly like, it did feel like it reduced the number of advantages in the game, the amount of dumb twists in the game, to where mixing that in with the fact that I think this is a really strong cast, I mean a really wacky cast that led to a lot of fun moments, and again had some pretty insane gameplay at points, again had some pretty big votes like the Kelly vote, the final 5 vote, the Emily vote, the Sabaya vote. Again, there were big rounds in this game, to where again I think this season has most of what you would want from modern Survivor, to where again I think this is by far the best season of the new era, and just in general one of the best modern seasons of the show. But with that, I mean, those are my thoughts on Survivor 45. Obviously, this being a ridiculously long review here. But obviously, with that, like tradition, I will be doing a player ranking for this season immediately following this. So following that, we'll be at the end of the year of 2023, to where I'll be doing my year in reality TV video, where I rank every reality show I've watched from the year 2023, which straight up is going to be ridiculous. Which is also where I'll give a bit of a channel update for 2024, where I do have very big plans for 2024, as we'll talk about. But obviously I'll be back for Survivor 46, doing the typical content for that next year, along with the other typical type of videos you can expect from the channel, so stay tuned for all of that. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.